Imagine, if you will, just sailing through this massive archipelago, like an area larger than the entire island of Jamaica.
Oh, easily.
Right. You're navigating through hundreds of cays, thousands of these jagged coral rocks and stunning white beaches.
Picture perfect.
Exactly. The water is that crazy crystalline, mesmerizing shade of turquoise. But as you sail for days, maybe even weeks, this really chilling realization kind of washes over you.
Because there's nothing there.
There is absolutely no smoke on the horizon. There are no boats in the water. I mean, there is absolutely zero sound of human life. Because it's the year 1520, and this area of over 5,000 square miles is completely, utterly, and just devastatingly silent. It's a true ghost archipelago.
Yeah, it's a profoundly unsettling image to start with, for sure. And it stands in absolute, almost, jarring contrast to what you picture when you hear the word Bahamas today.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this, because that contrast is exactly why we're diving into this topic today. When you close your eyes and you picture the Bahamas now, you see something entirely different from a ghost archipelago.
Oh, completely.
You see sprawling mega resorts on Paradise Island. You picture those massive, floating city cruise ships docked cheek by jowl in Nassau.
Thousands of people pouring off day.
Exactly. You envision someone lounging in a cabana with a frozen drink. It's been perfectly packaged as this ultimate postcard of effortless relaxation, a modern-day paradise that is basically just built for consumption.
It's a veneer of complete ease. The modern experience is engineered so that your biggest worry is, whether to reapply your SPF or maybe head back to the buffet line.
But the deeper you dig into the actual historical record, the sources we have, the more you realize that this modern veneer of effortless paradise is masking something truly wild.
Oh, absolutely wild.
So today we are embarking on a massive historical deep dive into the true story of the early Bahamas. And we are not looking at some sanitized tourist brochure here.
No, not at all.
This is an intense, dramatic saga. We're going to explore these strange geologic anomalies that literally dictate human survival. We're looking at a lost indigenous civilization whose daily vocabulary you, the listener, probably used this very morning.
Which is always a wild thing to realize.
It really is. And we'll get into these world-shattering collisions between hemispheres, this tragic demographic erasure, and honestly, some radical, bizarre, utopian experiments happening on the very edge of the known world.
And I think that's what makes this specific deep dive so compelling. In this history, the Bahamas isn't just like a passive backdrop where things happen. The geography itself is an active, aggressive participant in the story.
It fights back.
It really does. It's a stage where towering human ambition, whether that's a desperate search for Asian gold or, a yearning for a pure religious freedom, or even a mythological quest for eternal youth, all of that constantly crashes into these harsh, unyielding environmental realities. The story of these islands serves as this perfect microcosm for the birth of the entire New World.
Yeah. So before we can even begin to understand the ambition of the people who landed here, we have to understand the physical ground they were trying to conquer. Or, I guess, more accurately, the ancient coral they were desperately trying to survive on.
Right.
Let's look at the stage itself, because the physical layout of the Bahamas is staggering, and it pretty much dictates the mechanics of absolutely everything that follows.
Geography is destiny in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
Probably more so than anywhere else in the hemisphere. I mean, to give you a sense of scale, we are talking about an enormous archipelago extending southeast from just off the coast of Florida, stretching all the way down toward the northern coast of Haiti.
It's massive.
It is a vast scatter of land. You've got 29 major islands, 661 cays, and by the way, that's spelled C-A-Y-S, but pronounced keys, and over 2,000 isolated rocks and exposed reefs.
And the total land area is over 5,300 square miles. But the single most defining characteristic of all this land isn't really its size, is it? It's the elevation, or, well, the complete lack of it.
Yeah, the flatness is almost difficult to comprehend until you are actually standing there. I mean, the highest point in the entire country is Mount Alvernia on Cat Island. And let me tell you, Mount is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that name.
Yeah, it's what, a couple hundred feet?
Barely. It sits at just 206 feet above sea level. Most of these islands don't even have a single ridge higher than 100 feet.
Which raises an immediate physical question. Because if you think about how islands usually form, right?
Yeah.
We picture places like Hawaii or Iceland.
Volcanic islands.
Exactly. These towering volcanic peaks violently pushing out of the ocean floor, creating massive slopes and valleys. But the Bahamas are flat as a pancake. So how does a flat island actually form? Reading through the sources, the image that really clicked for me was that the Bahamas are essentially the flattened peaks of a massive submarine mountain range. Does that actually hold up geologically?
It's the most accurate way to visualize it, yeah. If you were to somehow, pull a giant plug and drain the Atlantic Ocean, the Bahamas would look terrifying. Oh, yeah. You would see that these low-lying islands are just the very flat plateaus sitting on top of staggering vertical underwater mountains. And between these flat peaks are these vast, deep oceanic canyons.
Wow.
Some of these underwater trenches, like one that's beautifully named the Tongue of the Ocean, they feature vertical walls that plunge down a terrifying 10,000 feet to the abyssal plain.
10,000 feet. That is just mind-bending for anyone who has ever waded in those waters. I mean, you're sitting on a beach, you're digging your toes into the sand just a few feet above sea level, and literally a mile offshore, the earth just abruptly falls away into a 2-mile deep abyss.
Yeah, it's basically an underwater cliff. And the material that makes up these towering underwater mountains is entirely limestone, just calcium carbonate.
No volcanic rock at all.
None. There is no volcanic basalt, no granite, no quartz found naturally anywhere in the Bahamas. It's just thousands upon thousands of feet of limestone. But the real mechanism of how the surface of the Bahamas got its current shape like, how those plateaus actually became islands, that requires us to look back at the Earth's climate history.
Okay.
Specifically, we need to look at the Wisconsin Ice Age, which reached its glacial maximum roughly 20,000 years ago.
Okay, stop right there, because this is where my brain starts to hurt a little bit. Explain the mechanics of how a massive sheet of ice sitting way up in Canada and the Arctic somehow builds a tropical coral island down in the Caribbean.
Right, it sounds totally disconnected.
Yeah.
But it comes down to the global water budget. It's a concept geologists refer to as the glacial control theory.
The glacial control theory.
Exactly. So during a major ice age, massive amounts of the Earth's water evaporate from the oceans, fall as snow near the poles, and then become locked up in gargantuan continental glaciers. Because all that water is literally trapped in ice, the sea level around the rest of the world plummets.
Because there's a finite amount of water on the planet.
Exactly. You're just moving it from the ocean to the land. So in the region of the Bahamas, during the peak of that Wisconsin Ice Age, the ocean level dropped by roughly 250 to 300 feet.
Which means, wait, that means all those incredibly shallow turquoise banks you sail over today between the islands, waters that are maybe 10 or 20 feet deep right now?
They would have been completely exposed dry land.
That's crazy.
Yeah. The Bahamas of 20,000 years ago wasn't a scattered chain of thousands of tiny islands. It was a massive, continuous, rolling landmass. It was likely much larger in total land area than modern-day Cuba.
You're kidding.
No. And we actually have the physical proof of this. Modern cave divers exploring deep submerged sinkholes in the Bahamas, which are known as blue holes, they've actually found the fossilized remains of tortoises and crocodiles down at depths of over 100 feet.
Wait, really? Down inside the caves?
Yes, and those animals require vast tracts of dry land and fresh water. They couldn't have possibly evolved or survived on the tiny fragmented islands we see today.
Oh, wow. Okay. But ice ages end. The climate warms up.
Right. The climate warmed, those continental glaciers began to melt, and trillions of gallons of fresh water poured back into the oceans. So the sea level began to rise, slowly flooding that massive Bahamian superisland. The valleys became those deep oceanic trenches we talked about, and the higher plateaus were slowly submerged.
But they didn't just drown entirely, because obviously they're still there. Something fought back against the rising water.
Biology fought back.
I love that.
It is the crucial mechanism here. The ocean water rose slowly, over thousands of years, and its rate of rise perfectly matched the biological upward growth rate of coral polyps.
Okay, so the bugs are building.
Basically, yeah. The waters around the Bahamas are the absolute ideal environment for coral building. The water temperature is perfectly warm, the shallow banks allow for maximum sunlight penetration, and most importantly, there is absolutely zero sediment in the water to choke the living polyps. So as the ocean inched upward, trillion upon trillion of these tiny marine organisms built their calcium carbonate skeletons upward, literally keeping pace with the surface of the water. The Bahamas are, in the truest, most literal sense, a biological construct built over eons.
That is just incredible. The whole nation is just a monument built by tiny marine architects.
Pretty much.
But I want to circle back to a key phrase you just used, because it creates a massive paradox for anyone trying to actually live there. You mentioned there is, quote, absolutely zero sediment in the water.
Yes.
Now, for you, the listener, if you've ever looked at a photo of the Bahamas, you know it's famous for having arguably the clearest ocean water on the planet. I mean, you can drop a coin and watch it sink 60 feet down like you're looking through glass. But the mechanism behind that crystal clear water is exactly what makes surviving on these islands a logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. Because the clarity of the water is a direct result of a total absence of terrestrial runoff.
Yeah.
There is no sediment in the ocean because there are absolutely zero rivers, streams, or creeks anywhere in the Bahamas. None.
No rivers at all. In an area larger than Jamaica. Why?
Because of the composition of the rock we just discussed, the ground is entirely made of porous limestone. Think of it like a giant fossilized sponge.
Okay.
When torrential tropical rain falls on the Bahamas, it doesn't collect on the surface. It doesn't form rivulets that carve into streams that flow into the ocean, carrying mud and silt. Instead, the rain hits the limestone and immediately percolates straight down through the millions of tiny pores and fissures in the rock.
It just vanishes into the ground.
Instantly.
So if there are no rivers and the ground is just this jagged, porous rock, how on earth did anyone manage to find drinking water? I mean, you look at it from a cruise ship today and it seems like this lush paradise. But underneath, it is a remarkably hostile, arid habitat.
It requires extreme adaptation. I mean, the soil itself is incredibly thin. Over thousands of years, you have decaying plant matter and even dust blown all the way across the Atlantic from the Sahara Desert.
Wait, Sahara dust?
Yeah, it blows across the ocean and collects. But it's mostly trapped in small, deep pockets in the limestone called banana holes.
Banana holes.
Right. You can't run a plow across a Bahamian island. In many places, the honeycomb limestone is so sharp and jagged you can barely walk across it in thick boots, let alone farm it.
But the water problem is the real killer, right? Humans can survive a long time without food, but only days without water.
The way fresh water exists in the Bahamas is basically a precarious geographic miracle. Because fresh water is slightly less dense than salt water, it floats.
Oh, like oil and vinegar.
Exactly. So when the rain soaks down into that porous limestone sponge, it hits the dense, heavy seawater that's permeating the rock from the ocean. The fresh water then pools on top of the salt water, forming what hydrologists call a freshwater lens. It is literally a thin, fragile layer of drinking water floating on a subterranean ocean of salt.
So imagine you're an early settler. You're trying to dig a well in your settlement. You chip through the hard limestone and finally you hit water. But you have to be incredibly delicate about it.
Extremely delicate. If you dig your well just a few inches too deep, you pierce the lens and you hit the salt water.
And it's ruined.
Ruined. And furthermore, if you draw water out of a perfectly dug well too rapidly, the suction actually pulls the heavier salt water up from below. It's a process called saltwater intrusion, and your well is ruined instantly.
Wow.
It is a landscape that demands total respect and profound adaptation. It does not yield easily to clumsy human habitation.
Which perfectly explains why the first people to actually pull off surviving here couldn't be massive agriculturalists. They couldn't rely on vast fields of wheat or deep-rooted crops. This harsh, razor-sharp limestone environment demanded a people who could look away from the land and look toward the sea. And that brings us to the first true Bahamians, the Lucayans.
The Lucayans. The word itself translates in their language to island people. They were a deeply fascinating culture that managed to achieve an almost perfect equilibrium with this incredibly challenging ecosystem.
So where did they come from? Because human beings don't just spontaneously evolve on a coral rock in the middle of the Atlantic. They had to travel there, and crossing open ocean in pre-Columbian times is no small feat.
No, it's a massive undertaking. To trace the origins of the Lucayans, you actually have to look far to the south, back to the massive river basins of the South American mainland, specifically the Orinoco River system in modern-day Venezuela.
Okay, so a long way away.
Very long. They're a part of a much larger, vast, indigenous linguistic and cultural group known as the Arawaks.
And I read in the sources that the name Arawak itself is highly descriptive of their lifestyle. It translates roughly to meal eaters.
Yes, referring to their absolute reliance on cassava, which is also known as yucca or manioc.
Right.
They would grate the bitter root of the cassava plant, carefully press out the toxic prussic acid using these woven tubes, and then bake the remaining meal into flatbreads. It was the caloric engine of their entire civilization. That over many centuries, these Arawak peoples began a grand migration out of South America. They moved northward, slowly island-hopping their way up through the long chain of the Lesser Antilles, spreading throughout the Caribbean basin.
But here is the question I just kept asking myself while reading the sources. Why keep moving? I mean, if you are migrating out of South America and you land on a beautiful, lush, mountainous island like Martinique or Puerto Rico, right? An island with deep volcanic soil and fresh running rivers, why not just stay put? Why keep pushing all the way to the very edge of the Atlantic, eventually settling on these relatively barren, riverless Bahamian rocks?
It wasn't wanderlust. It was terror.
Terror!
The Arawaks were being driven out. Migrating along the exact same island-hopping route, always just a few centuries or decades behind them, was another indigenous group, the Caribs.
Oh.
And the cultural clash between the two was apocalyptic for the Arawaks.
How so? Like, what made the Caribs so terrifying?
Well, the Caribs were a fiercely aggressive, expansionist, and warlike culture. Their entire societal structure was oriented around combat, maritime raiding, and the violent subjugation of their neighbors.
Yeah.
They raided the peaceful Arawak settlements relentlessly, and the standard operating procedure of a Carib raid was to kill the Arawak men and often ritually consume them, and then capture the women to serve as enslaved wives.
Wait, ritually consumed. We're talking about cannibalism.
Yes. The historical and archaeological records strongly indicate the Caribs practiced ritual anthropophagy, cannibalism. In fact, the English word cannibal is a direct derivation of the Spanish mispronunciation of the name Carib, or Carabal.
Really? I had no idea that's where the word came from.
Yeah, it's a direct link. And the psychological pressure on the Arawaks was immense. The Carib religion even promised their warriors a specialized heaven where they would be eternally served by enslaved Arawak souls.
Wow. So this wasn't just a border dispute over fishing rights. This was an existential threat. The Arawaks are essentially fleeing for their lives, just constantly seeking a horizon where the Carib war canoes couldn't reach them.
Exactly. They reached the large islands of Hispaniola, which is modern Haiti and the Dominican Republic, around 200 AD. They spread into Cuba and Jamaica shortly after that. But the Caribs just kept advancing. Finally, sometime between 500 and 600 AD, the most desperate or maybe adventurous waves of this great migration pushed out across the deep water channels into the southern and central Bahamas.
Because the Caribs wouldn't follow them there.
Right. They were pushed to the absolute geographic edge of the Caribbean just to find a safe haven.
That dramatically reframes how you look at the Lucayans, doesn't it? They weren't just intrepid oceanic explorers seeking out cool new frontiers. They were refugees.
Very much so.
They found this harsh, rocky, riverless archipelago, and they made a calculation. They basically decided, you know what? We can make this work. The soil is terrible. We have to sip water from a floating subterranean lens. But hey, at least the Caribs aren't here.
It was a trade-off. Extreme environmental hardship in exchange for profound peace. And once they arrived, their isolation allowed them to develop a highly distinct culture. By the time Europeans arrived roughly 1,000 years later, the Spanish were immediately struck by their physical appearance. Observers describe them as remarkably handsome, taller than Europeans of the era, with broad, almost oriental facial features and tawny skin.
But the Spanish also noted a very specific universal physical modification, right?
Yes.
A cranial modification, the forehead flattening. I was reading the mechanics of how they did this in the sources, and it sounds incredibly intense.
It was. The Lucayans practiced a form of artificial cranial deformation. Shortly after a child was born, while the bones of the skull, the fontanelles, were still soft and pliable, the mother would bind flat wooden boards firmly against the infant's forehead.
Just imagining the mechanics of that, applying continuous pressure to a baby's growing skull. It sounds dangerous, but they clearly perfected the technique over generations, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a deeply ingrained cultural aesthetic. They considered a sloping, flattened forehead to be the pinnacle of beauty and nobility. It distinguished them visually from other tribes. But there was also a remarkable physiological byproduct to this cosmetic practice.
Yeah, the sources mention that because the bone was constantly compressed during development, the frontal bone of the skull became incredibly thickened and dense.
Very dense.
There are actually Spanish accounts claiming that this modified bone structure was so strong that it could sometimes deflect a direct blow from an enemy weapon. And in later years, Spanish soldiers reported their steel swords actually breaking or just glancing off Lucayan skulls during skirmishes.
Which is wild. Now, we must always be slightly skeptical of Spanish exaggerations regarding their own martial difficulties, but the biomechanical reality is that compressing the skull in that manner does significantly increase the bone density in the frontal lobe area.
It creates a helmet.
A biological safety helmet, exactly.
Right.
Whether it was fully intentional as a defensive measure or simply a byproduct of their beauty standards, It was a profound physical adaptation.
But beyond their physical appearance, what really fascinates me is their technological adaptation. Because let's remember the context here. The Lucayans possessed no metal whatsoever.
None.
No iron, no copper, no bronze. Every single tool they used had to be fashioned from limestone, coral, bone, wood, or conch shell. And yet they built these massive pieces of engineering. Let's talk about their maritime technology, because if you live on an archipelago of 29 islands, you absolutely must master the water.
Without question. The dugout canoe was the absolute center of the Lucayan universe. And by the way, we owe the very word to them. Canoe comes directly from the Arawak word canoe.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Now, without metal axes or steel saws, felling a massive tree and hollowing it out is a monumental feat of applied physics and chemistry.
Right, so how do you do it? You can't just hack down a towering mahogany or silk cotton tree with a sharpened clamshell. That would take forever.
They utilized controlled fire as their primary tool. They would locate a massive tree, often a silk cotton tree, and to fell it, they would pack wet clay around the trunk just above the base to protect the upper wood. Then they would build a small, intensely hot fire right at the base, constantly tending it, letting the fire eat through the trunk while using that wet clay to prevent the whole tree from catching alight.
Wow, so they literally burned the tree down with surgical precision.
Exactly. And once it was felled, they would use the exact same technique to hollow out the center. They would place hot coals along the top of the trunk, fanning the embers to char the wood deeply. Then they would scrape out the burned, softened wood using heavy stone adzes or sharpened conch shells. They just repeated this process, burn, scrape, until they had a perfectly shaped hull.
And these weren't just little two-person rowboats for puttering around a lagoon either.
Not at all. I mean, while they had smaller craft for daily fishing, their voyaging canoes were staggering in scale. The Spanish recorded seeing single dugout canoes carved from one continuous tree trunk, mind you. They were 96 feet long and 8 feet wide.
96 feet.
Yes.
That's the length of a modern passenger jet fuselage, out of one tree.
And they were capable of holding up to 150 rowers.
150 people paddling in unison. The sheer kinetic energy of that. It's not a boat, it's mass transit.
It really is. With 150 rowers using their traditional shovel-shaped wooden paddles, these canoes were incredibly swift. Early European observers actually noted with a lot of frustration that a fully manned Lucayan canoe could easily outpace the fastest Spanish sailing caravels of the era.
That's amazing.
They navigated the dangerous reef-strewn shoals and the deep, treacherous channels of the Bahamas with absolute generations-deep confidence.
So they have transportation completely mastered. But what about feeding themselves? We established earlier that large-scale agriculture is practically impossible on this porous limestone. They could grow a little bit of cassava in the soil mounds they built, maybe some maize in the deeper banana holes, but you can't feed a population of 40,000 people on a few handfuls of dirt.
No, you can't.
They had to be extracting massive amounts of protein from the ocean.
The ocean was their true larder. If you examine Lucayan middens today, which are their ancient calcified trash heaps, they are overwhelmingly packed with the shells of mollusks, particularly the queen conch, which honestly remains a staple of the Bahamian diet to this day.
Right.
But they were also highly sophisticated fishermen. They wove intricate nets from indigenous cotton. They carved delicate specialized fish hooks from turtle bone. They utilized bone-tipped harpoons for larger prey.
And there was one fishing technique mentioned in the sources that I found absolutely ingenious, though it borders on the unbelievable, frankly, the use of remoras.
Oh yes, it is a remarkable example of biological tool use. A remora is a type of sucking fish that has this modified dorsal fin acting like a powerful suction cup, which it uses to attach itself to larger marine animals like sharks or sea turtles. The Lucayans and other Caribbean peoples too, they would catch a remora, carefully tie a thin, strong cord around its tail, and keep it in the water near their canoe.
Wait, they kept it on a leash.
Precisely.
Wow.
When they spotted a large sea turtle or a massive fish resting near the surface, they would paddle quietly nearby and release the remora. The remora, naturally seeking a host, would dart over and clamp its powerful suction cup onto the turtle's shell.
And then the fisherman just reels them both in.
Exactly. The suction is so strong that a skilled fisherman could haul a heavy turtle right up to the canoe using the remora as a living, self-attaching grapple hook.
That is just brilliant applied biology. Now, the ocean provided almost everything, but did they have any terrestrial meat? Like, were there any animals on the islands to hunt?
Very few. The Bahamas were incredibly impoverished when it came to land mammals. In fact, there was only one native land mammal of any significance, a creature called the hutia, or utia.
Which looks a bit like a cross between a rabbit and a giant rat,
A
right?
large herbivorous rodent, yes. And to hunt it, the Lucayans brought with them their only domesticated animal, a very specific breed of dog known as an elko.
This detail paints such a vivid picture for me. A small, yellowish dog that, according to the Spanish at least, was completely incapable of barking.
They were silent hunters, which was perfect for flushing the Utia out of the dense, thorny scrub brush that covers much of the Bahamian islands.
A barkless dog hunting giant rodents on a coral rock. It's an incredible scene. And I want to make sure we don't just paint them as people constantly struggling on the edge of survival, because a society that is constantly starving doesn't have time for leisure. And the Lucayans absolutely had leisure time. They had a complex society, and they played highly organized sports.
Yes, they dedicated significant time and resources to a highly developed ball game called batos. And this wasn't just, kids kicking a rock on the beach. Every major Lucayan village featured a specifically cleared rectangular plaza dedicated solely to this game, often flanked by carved stone seating for spectators.
The mechanics of the game sound exhausting, honestly. It was played by teams of up to 30 people, men against men, or sometimes women against women. And the rules were essentially a hybrid of modern volleyball and soccer.
Right. The objective was to keep the ball continuously in the air, but you were strictly forbidden from using your hands. Players had to strike the ball using their heads, shoulders, hips, or knees. If the ball hit the ground on your team side of the plaza, the opposing team scored a point.
But the most shocking thing to me isn't the rules, it's the ball itself. We are talking about the pre-Columbian era, hundreds of years before the Industrial Revolution, and they're playing with a bouncy, elastic rubber ball.
It is a technological marvel. It completely baffled the first Europeans who witnessed it. I mean, the Spanish were only familiar with balls made of inflated pig bladders or stitched leather stuffed with rags, which barely bounced at all. The Lucayan ball was likely made from the boiled resin of specific indigenous trees, mixed with juices from local vines to coagulate the latex.
Think about the implications of that. Centuries before Charles Goodyear supposedly, invents vulcanized rubber in the 1800s, indigenous people across the Caribbean and Mesoamerica are actively harvesting latex, altering its chemical properties to make it durable and elastic, and using it for competitive sports.
Yeah.
It just completely dismantles that tired, arrogant, historical narrative of primitive societies waiting for European technology.
It truly does. Their society was deeply rich, not just technologically, but spiritually. Their entire cosmology was oriented around maintaining a delicate balance with the forces of nature. They worshipped a pantheon of spirits known as zemis.
And these zemis weren't abstract concepts living up in the sky. They were physically present in the world around them.
Yes, zemis resided in specific sacred trees, in elaborately carved wooden or stone idols, or, and this was considered the most powerful, in the carefully preserved skeletal relics of their own ancestors. The role of the Lucayan priest, or cacique, was to commune with these zemis to keep them appeased. Because if the zemis were angry, they would fail to protect the Lucayans from the four great existential terrors of their world.
Which were?
Fire, which could wipe out a village of thatched huts in minutes. Sickness, the devastating power of Caribbean hurricanes, and of course, the ever-present lurking dread of the Caribs returning.
And their religious rituals to commune with these spirits left a rather massive, indelible mark on the rest of the globe. A ritual that the sources jokingly refer to as the Arawaks' revenge.
A darkly fitting term, considering the global health consequences over the next 5 centuries. You're referring to the cultivation and consumption of tobacco.
Exactly. The Lucayans, alongside their cousins in Cuba, cultivated a broad-leaved plant they called cohiba. But they didn't smoke it casually over a cup of coffee. The mechanics of how they consumed it were violently intense.
It was not a recreational habit, no. It was a potent, hallucinogenic ritual designed to induce a trance state. The priests used a specific instrument, a hollowed-out, Y-shaped wooden tube. And they call this instrument a tobacco.
And here's the mechanism that blew my mind. They didn't put the tube in their mouths.
No. They would place crushed, smoldering cohiba leaves, or sometimes a highly potent pulverized narcotic snuff on a small fire. Then they would insert the 2 upper prongs of the Y-shaped tobacco pipe directly into their nostrils.
Ouch.
Yeah. They would lean over the burning leaves and inhale the smoke deeply and rapidly straight into their nasal cavities.
Delivering this massive hit of nicotine and other alkaloids directly through the mucous membranes and straight to the brain.
The physical effect was instantaneous and overwhelming.
Yeah.
The user would essentially hyperventilate this potent smoke until they lost consciousness, collapsing into a deep stupor, during which they believed they were communing directly with the Zemis.
And when the Spanish arrived, they witnessed this intense religious trance ritual, completely stripped away all of its spiritual and cultural context, and just thought, hey, breathing smoke looks interesting, let's try it.
Yeah.
They took the habit and the name of the pipe tobacco back to Europe, sparking a global addiction that has killed millions. The Arawaks' revenge indeed.
It is arguably one of the most profound and ultimately destructive cultural exchanges in human history.
Yeah.
But tobacco is far from the only legacy we've inherited from the Lucayans. Despite having no written language, their spoken vocabulary has survived the centuries and is embedded in the English language you use every day.
This is a really fascinating aspect of the deep dive. The linguistic ghosts of the Arawaks. If you, the listener, have ever relaxed between two trees in a hammock, or if you've ever cooked meat outside on a barbecue, or paddled a canoe, or boarded up your windows for a hurricane, or eaten a potato, a papaya, or some maize, you are speaking Arawak. You are using the exact words developed by the Lucayan people on those coral rocks.
Iguana, manatee, guava, K. The list is really extensive. When the Spanish arrived, they encountered all these new flora, fauna, and technologies for which they had no European words. So they simply adopted the Lucayan words, which subsequently bled into English and French. It is a linguistic preservation of a culture that was physically destroyed.
And speaking of that physical destruction, as rich and peaceful as their society was on those isolated islands, there was a dark psychological cloud hanging over it. Because passed down through generations of their priests, there was a deeply unsettling prophecy.
It is a haunting detail of their mythology. Similar to the apocalyptic prophecies held by the Aztecs in central Mexico, the Lucayan spiritual leaders foretold a specific doom. They warned that one day a race of clothed, bearded demigods would arrive from across the vast Eastern Ocean.
From the direction where there was supposed to be nothing but endless water?
Yes. And the prophecy stated that these beings would wield the terrifying power of thunder and lightning in their hands. Furthermore, the priests warned that against these beings, any armed resistance would be absolutely futile. The only possible way to avert total annihilation would be through total meekness, generosity, and conciliation.
It just gives me absolute chills. Picture being a Lucayan fisherman. You're sitting on the eastern shore of your island, looking out across the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, and somewhere deep in your cultural subconscious is the knowledge that an unstoppable nightmare is eventually going to sail out of that sunrise.
Yeah.
And then in the early morning hours of October 12, 1492, that prophecy was violently pulled from the realm of myth into crushing reality.
The arrival of Christopher Columbus. It is the definitive hinge upon which the history of the modern world turns. The collision of two hemispheres that had been separated for tens of thousands of years.
We really need to set the stage for this specific voyage, because the popular myth of Columbus that most of us are taught is so heavily sanitized and simplified. We are taught he was this visionary hero proving the world was round. But the historical reality of that first voyage is a story of intense desperation, massive mathematical errors, and a crew on the brink of murderous mutiny.
Let's correct that first misconception immediately, actually. Columbus was not trying to prove the Earth was a sphere. The concept of a flat Earth was entirely a myth invented much later. Every educated person, every sailor, every monarch in 15th century Europe knew the Earth was round. They had known it since the ancient Greeks calculated it.
Right. Everyone agreed it was a globe. What they disagreed on was the circumference of that globe.
Exactly. Columbus's entire enterprise of the Indies was based on a fundamentally, almost comically flawed mathematical premise. He was desperate to find a direct western sea route to the immense wealth of Asia, specifically the spices of India, the silks of China, and the gold of Cipangu, which is modern-day Japan.
Because the overland routes were blocked.
Right, the traditional overland routes were controlled by hostile empires, and the Portuguese were monopolizing the route around Africa. Columbus believed sailing west was the shortcut.
But his shortcut only works if the math works, and his math was spectacularly wrong. Can you explain the mechanism of how he messed up the calculations so badly?
It was a compounding series of wishful calculations. First, he relied on the writings of a 9th century Persian astronomer named Alfraganus to calculate the length of a degree of longitude. But Columbus made a fatal unit conversion error. He assumed Alfraganus was using the shorter Roman mile, when in fact he was using the much longer Arabic mile.
Oh, wow. So he instantly shrinks the size of the Earth by roughly 25% just through a bad unit conversion.
Yes. And on top of that, he heavily relied on the geographic estimates of Marco Polo and Ptolemy, wildly overestimating the eastward sprawl of the Eurasian continent.
Making Asia huge.
Making Asia huge.
Yeah.
By stretching Asia out and shrinking the globe, Columbus calculated that Japan was only about 3,000 miles west of the Canary Islands.
And what is the actual distance?
Over 11,000 miles.
Oh my God.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation. If the massive unknown continents of the Americas hadn't been sitting exactly in the middle of the ocean to physically block his path, Columbus and his entire crew would have inevitably sailed into an endless sea and slowly starved to death.
He was essentially trying to sell a venture capital pitch to the monarchs of Europe based on cooked books. And for years, the experts in Portugal and Spain rejected him because they knew his math was wrong. But finally, in 1492, he catches Queen Isabella of Spain in a euphoric mood. Spain has just finished the Reconquista, expelling the Moors from Granada. They have a unified country, a zeal for expansion, and suddenly some risk capital to spare, so she funds him.
She does. He set sail in August 1492 from Spain, stops in the Canary Islands for repairs, and on September 6th, his 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, drop the coast of Africa below the horizon and sail westward into the absolute void.
And this is where the sheer psychological terror of the voyage sets in. Imagine you're a 15th century sailor on one of those wooden ships.
For 31 excruciating days, they saw nothing but endless ocean and the bizarre, floating sargassum weed of the Sargasso Sea. You have to understand, no European sailor in recorded history had ever been completely out of sight of land for that long and lived to tell the tale.
The psychological toll must have been unbearable. And there was a specific meteorological phenomenon terrifying them too, right? The trade winds.
The easterly trade winds. For weeks, the wind blew steadily from the east, pushing them flawlessly westward. While that sounds ideal for getting to their destination, to the sailors, it was a death sentence.
Because they can't get back.
They began to believe that in this part of the ocean, the wind only ever blew west, meaning even if they wanted to, they could never ever sail back home against it.
By the second week of October, the tension boils over. The crew is on the verge of open, violent mutiny.
On October 10th, the crew essentially stages an intervention. They demand Columbus turn the ships around immediately. Columbus, displaying his incredible stubbornness, refuses, but he begs them for just 3 or 4 more days. He promises that if they don't see land by then, he will agree to turn back.
He is gambling everything on a few dozen hours. And then we get to the night of October 11th. And here is where the story gets incredibly dark and offers a really revealing look at Columbus's moral character. Because there was a massive financial prize at stake for the first person to actually spot land.
Right. Queen Isabella, to incentivize the crew, had promised a lifetime royal pension of 10,000 maravedis to the very first man who sighted land.
Which, to a common, illiterate sailor earning a pittance, is life-changing generational wealth. It's basically winning the lottery.
Precisely. So according to Columbus's own official journal, at about 10 p.m. on the night of October 11th, he was standing on the stern castle of the Santa Maria and claimed he saw a faint light bobbing in the darkness ahead, quote, like a little wax candle rising and falling.
Convenient.
Very. He called over a few of his officers, who claimed they might have seen it too, but they didn't officially call out land.
Because if you call land and it's a false alarm, you lose your right to the prize forever.
Right. So the ships keep sailing through the dark. Then at 2 a.m. on October 12th, the Pinta, which was the fastest ship and was sailing ahead of the fleet, fires a cannon. A lookout stationed high in the rigging of the Pinta, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, sees the moonlight reflecting off a white line of sand in the distance. He screams the famous words, "Tierra! Tierra."
So Rodrigo de Triana spots the sand, fires the gun, and secures a wealthy retirement.
He should have. But when the fleet eventually returned to Spain months later in triumph, Columbus flatly denied Rodrigo the prize. Columbus claimed the reward for himself, arguing to the crown that the imaginary bobbing wax candle he saw hours earlier was actually a fire on the land.
But mathematically, that's impossible, isn't it?
Completely impossible. Based on the speed of the ships at 10 p.m., they were likely still 35 or 40 miles offshore. Because of the curvature of the Earth, Columbus couldn't possibly have seen a fire on a flat Bahamian beach from that distance. Furthermore, they were sailing in the middle of a gale. No Lucayan would be out in a canoe in the open ocean with a candle in those conditions.
So Columbus essentially stole the defining, triumphant moment of the entire voyage and the cash prize from his own lookout. It is a petty, revealing theft. Rodrigo de Triana was reportedly so disgusted by the betrayal that he later abandoned Christianity, moved to North Africa, and converted to Islam.
It is a dark prologue to what comes next. But regardless of who saw it first, the fleet drops anchor and waits for dawn. When the sun rises, they find a break in the barrier reef, lower their rowboats, and row toward a lush island that the native inhabitants called Guanahani.
Okay.
Columbus immediately renames it San Salvador, claiming it for Christ. Today, it is largely accepted to be Watling's Island in the central Bahamas.
The moment of landfall must have been a profoundly surreal, almost hallucinogenic experience for both sides. I want you, the listener, to try and imagine this from the perspective of the Lucayans watching from the tree line.
It is the literal manifestation of their darkest prophecy. Out of the Eastern Ocean, where nothing should be, arrive 3 floating wooden mountains with massive white wings.
It's alien.
Completely alien. Out of these ships come pale, hairy men covered in shining metal armor, carrying bizarre weapons and shouting in a guttural alien language. Columbus wades ashore, heavily armed, carrying the royal banners of the Green Cross. He falls to his knees in the sand, weeping, kissing the ground, and formally reading a legal proclamation taking possession of the land for the King and Queen of Spain.
And the Lucayans, what are they doing during this?
Initially, pure terror. They fled into the dense brush. But eventually, human curiosity, combined with their deep cultural mandate for generosity, and perhaps the memory of that prophecy requiring conciliation, won out. They slowly, cautiously emerged from the forest and walked down to the beach.
And here begins the great, tragic misunderstanding of the Americas. The Lucayans approach, and they bring their most prized possessions to offer as diplomatic gifts to these strange beings.
They brought brightly colored green parrots, wooden darts, and large, beautifully woven skeins of cotton thread. They were offering the finest products of their environment.
And what does Columbus, the representative of the most powerful empire in Europe, give them in return for these beautiful gifts? Literal garbage.
It highlights the total disconnect in the concept of value. Columbus gave them broken shards of green glass, fragments of cheap crockery, and tiny brass hawk's bells used in European falconry.
But to the Lucayans, who had never in their entire history seen smelted metal or blown glass, these items were miracles.
They viewed them as the most precious jewels imaginable. They were absolutely delighted. But while the Lucayans were marveling at the brass bells, Columbus was coldly observing them. His journal entries from that very first day are chilling in their calculation.
Really chilling.
He noted how handsome and well-proportioned they were. He was amazed by their open generosity, writing that they would offer you anything they owned with as much love as if they were giving you their hearts.
But he wasn't writing an anthropological study. He was doing an inventory.
Exactly. His next lines reveal his true intent. He noted that they were completely ignorant of European weaponry. To test this, he drew a steel sword and offered it to a Lucayan man. The man, having never seen a sharpened metal edge, innocently grabbed it by the blade and sliced his hand open.
Wow.
Columbus watched this and immediately wrote his conclusion, quote, "They ought to be good servants and of good skill. I believe that they would easily be made Christians, because it seemed to me that they belonged to no religion. I will carry off 6 of them at my departure to the sovereigns, so that they may learn to speak."
It takes my breath away every time I read it. Within hours of meeting these peaceful, incredibly generous people, his brain leaps straight to, they are docile, they don't have iron weapons, they will make excellent compliant slaves, and I am going to kidnap 6 of them right now to use as my personal GPS. It is a brutally cold economic calculation.
Because the underlying motivation for every single action Columbus took was the desperate need to find gold. He had promised his investors, the Spanish crown, rivers of gold and spices. He was convinced he was on the outskirts of the wealthy Asian empires, and he noticed a fatal detail on the Lucayans.
And nose rings.
Yes, some of the Lucayans wore tiny hammered pieces of gold suspended from their septums. Columbus became intensely, obsessively focused on this. Through furious sign language, he demanded to know where the yellow metal came from.
And the Lucayans, operating under their mandate to be helpful and accommodating to these aggressive strangers, point toward the south.
They pointed south toward the much larger islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, indicating that larger tribes down there had more of the metal.
It's a tragic irony. They were probably just trying to give directions to be helpful, or maybe even trying to get these demanding strangers to leave their island. Like, oh, you want the yellow rocks? Yeah, the guys a few islands down have plenty of that. Go bother them.
Right.
But by pointing south, they inadvertently drew the massive, violent machinery of Spanish conquest deeper into the heart of the Americas, sealing their own fate in the process.
Columbus spent only 15 days in the Bahamas. He hopped his ships from San Salvador to Rum Cay, down to Long Island, over to Crooked Island, always guided, or rather misled, by his kidnapped Lucayan captives, who were desperately trying to navigate him toward anywhere but their home villages.
Just trying to protect their families.
Exactly. Eventually, Columbus left the Bahamian archipelago entirely and sailed south to Cuba and Hispaniola, chasing the illusion of Asian wealth.
He left the Bahamas thinking the islands were essentially useless. They were pretty, the people were nice, but there was no gold, no spices, and no deep soil for plantations. So he moves on.
He dismisses them.
But that 15-day visit was not the end of the story for the Lucayans. Columbus leaving didn't save them, because the Spanish were going to come back. Not for the land, because as we've established, it's just coral rock, but for the only valuable resource the Bahamas had left, its human beings.
And this brings us to what historians consider one of the most rapid, complete, and devastating demographic catastrophes in recorded human history. To understand why the Spanish returned to the Bahamas to enslave the Lucayans, we have to look at the economic engine they were building on the larger islands to the south.
Right, you're talking about the encomienda system in Hispaniola. Explain the mechanics of how this system devoured people.
When the Spanish established their permanent colonies on Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic and later Cuba, they instituted a brutal legal and economic system called the encomienda. The Spanish crown granted vast tracts of land to colonial officers and conquistadors. Along with the land, they were granted the right to demand tribute and forced unpaid labor from all the indigenous people living on that land.
The justification being that the Spanish were, protecting them and teaching them Christianity.
That was the theological cover, yeah, for what was, in practice, a system of absolute slavery. The Spanish forced the native Taino people into the rivers to pan for gold dust and forced them to clear forests for massive agricultural plantations.
But the indigenous people of the Caribbean weren't built for that kind of labor, were they?
Not at all.
Hmm.
Their traditional society was based on subsistence farming and fishing, which required perhaps a few hours of labor a day, leaving ample time for family, religion, and leisure. Suddenly, they were forced into relentless, back-breaking, dawn-to-dusk labor under the whips of Spanish overseers.
It's a complete system shock.
The physical shock of the labor, combined with severe malnutrition because they were no longer allowed to grow their own food, was devastating. And then, the final, fatal blow, the introduction of European pathogens.
The diseases?
Smallpox, measles, and influenza, for which the indigenous populations had zero acquired immunity. It swept through the islands like a scythe.
The death toll is almost impossible to comprehend. The sources note that the despair was so total that the Arawak peoples were engaging in mass suicide.
The accounts by Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who witnessed these atrocities and became a fierce, lifelong advocate for the indigenous peoples, are harrowing. He wrote of natives drinking poisonous cassava juice to kill themselves rather than go to the mines.
Oh my
He
God.
documented mothers suffocating their own newborn infants to spare them the horror of growing up under Spanish rule.
So because the local Taino population is dying off at this staggering exponential rate, the Spanish economic machine hits a wall. They have gold mines and sugar fields, but they are running out of human bodies to work them.
They faced a severe labor shortage. To keep the wealth flowing back to Spain, they desperately needed more slaves. And so the colonial administrators in Hispaniola looked north. They remembered the reports from Columbus of thousands of islands inhabited by a peaceful, unarmed, docile people.
The Lucayans?
Yes. Around the year 1500, the Spanish launched a massive, coordinated slaving campaign into the Bahamas.
But here's the thing that really struck me. They didn't just sail up with an armada, land troops on the beaches, and fight a massive war to capture them. That would have been too costly and difficult across hundreds of tiny islands. Instead, the Spanish utilized a psychological trap that is truly insidious.
It was a betrayal that weaponized the Lucayans' deepest spiritual beliefs against them. The Spanish slavers, through their interpreters, had learned the intricacies of the Lucayan religion. Specifically, they learned about the Lucayan concept of the afterlife.
The myth of Coyaba.
Exactly. The Lucayans believed that when they died, their souls migrated to a heavenly paradise located far to the south. This paradise was called Coyaba. They believed it was a place where they would be reunited with the spirits of their beloved ancestors, where they would feast, dance, and live eternally free from the fear of hurricanes or the Caribs.
So the Spanish take this sacred, comforting belief and they use it as bait. The sources describe Spanish slave ships pulling up to a Bahamian island. The slavers stand on the deck and tell the Lucayans, We come from the southern lands. Come aboard our magnificent ships, and we will physically take you to Coyaba. We will sail you to reunite with the spirits of your departed mothers and fathers.
Imagine the emotional power of that offer. The Lucayans, who still largely viewed these strange, powerful Europeans through a mythological lens, believed them. They willingly, joyfully boarded the Spanish slave ships by the hundreds, entire families together, eager to see their ancestors.
It's sickening. It's the equivalent of someone today knocking on your door, praying on your deepest religious faith, promising to literally drive you to heaven to see your dead grandparents, and instead locking you in the hull of a ship to be sold into a nightmare sweatshop.
Once the ships were packed full, the Lucayans were chained below decks in horrific, cramped conditions. They were transported south to Hispaniola to die in the mines, or worse, they were sold to the pearl fisheries.
Let's talk about the pearl fisheries, because the specific mechanics of this labor, as detailed by Las Casas, highlight the utter brutality of the era. The Lucayans were highly prized for this specific job, weren't they?
They were. Because the Lucayans had grown up on an archipelago, they were universally renowned as magnificent swimmers and freedivers. They could hold their breath for extraordinary amounts of time, a skill they developed harvesting conch from the deep channels.
Right, they've been doing it for 1,000 years.
Because of this unique biological skill, a healthy Lucayan man could be sold for massive sums, sometimes up to 150 gold crowns, to be sent to the pearl fisheries off the island of Margarita near the coast of modern-day Venezuela.
Explain the physical process of what these divers were forced to do.
The conditions were a waking nightmare. The Lucayans were forced to dive from sunrise to sunset in deep, often treacherous water. They would plunge down 50 or 60 feet with a heavy stone weight to reach the bottom quickly, frantically tear oysters from the reef until their lungs were bursting, and kick back to the surface.
And then do it again.
They were given barely enough time to catch their breath before an overseer in a boat would beat them with a whip or a stick to force them back under.
And the physiological toll on the human body doing repeated deep dives without modern decompression knowledge. It destroys you.
They suffered massive barotrauma, ruptured eardrums, hypothermia from being submerged all day, and were frequently attacked by sharks. Las Casas noted a deeply disturbing physical transformation in the divers. He wrote that the constant exposure to the salt water, the intense tropical sun, and the severe starving physical stress caused the Lucayans' naturally straight dark hair to turn a bleached, frizzy, burned color. He described them as looking like sea wolves.
That is just bleak.
They were literally worked until their bodies broke down and they drowned from sheer exhaustion.
And the scale of this slaving operation. Las Casas recorded a detail about the logistics of the slave ships that is just macabre.
He claimed that the mortality rate on the slave ships crossing from the Bahamas to Hispaniola was so horrific due to starvation, lack of water, and suffocating conditions in the holds that dead Lucayans were constantly being thrown overboard. He wrote that a Spanish ship could successfully navigate the entire voyage from Hispaniola to the Bahamas without ever using a compass, simply by following the trail of floating, rotting corpses left in the water by the ships ahead of them.
Wow. Now, historians often point out that Las Casas was a polemicist. He sometimes exaggerated numbers to shock the King of Spain into changing the laws. But even if we adjust the specific numbers, the core, undeniable truth of the outcome remains the same.
The demographic outcome is absolute. The Spanish began this intensive slaving campaign in the Bahamas around the year 1500. By 1520, the entire slaving operation ceased. Why? Because there was no one left to capture.
20 years, an entire unique civilization, a population estimated at roughly 40,000 people, with a 1,000-year history, complex religion, language, and technology, completely systematically erased from the face of the earth in just 2 decades.
It is a total demographic void. To illustrate just how empty the Bahamas became, we have the record of Juan Ponce de Leon. In 1513, just a decade into the slaving campaign, Ponce de Leon sailed through the Bahamas on a highly official voyage.
And he wasn't looking for slaves. He was on one of the most famously bizarre quests in history.
He was searching for the Fountain of Youth. He had heard rumors, passed from captive Arawaks in Puerto Rico, about a mythical island called Bimini, where a spring of running water existed that could magically rejuvenate the elderly. It sounds like a fairy tale today, but in the 16th century, the boundary between geography and mythology was highly porous. Ponce de Leon actually secured a legal charter from the King of Spain, granting him the rights to govern Bimini once he found it.
So he sails his ships directly through the Bahamas, zigzagging across the archipelago, stopping at dozens of islands to search for this magical spring. And what does he find?
He obviously didn't find the fountain. He eventually sailed further west and accidentally stumbled onto the coast of a massive landmass he named La Florida. And crucially, on his return journey, he discovered the Gulf Stream, the massive, powerful, warm-water oceanic current that flows north along the American coast before turning toward Europe.
Which is huge for shipping later.
It would change global shipping forever, becoming the superhighway for Spanish treasure fleets. But regarding the Bahamas, the most telling detail of Ponce de Leon's voyage is what he didn't find. He searched island after island, anchoring in coves, sending landing parties ashore. And in all those weeks of searching an area the size of Jamaica, his logs report finding only a single human being.
One person.
They found one, incredibly old Lucayan woman, completely alone on a small cay. They took her aboard to act as a guide. She was quite literally the last known survivor of her civilization.
Just pause and imagine the profound, deafening silence of those islands. 1,000 years of ball games, fires, canoes, and village life. Gone. Replaced by nothing but the sound of the wind and the surf.
After that, the Spanish essentially wrote off the Bahamas entirely. The islands became known not as a destination, but as a severe maritime hazard. They were a feared, complex labyrinth of shallow banks, unpredictable currents, and jagged, ship-killing reefs that constantly threatened the heavy Spanish galleons returning from Havana loaded with silver. For over a century, the Bahamas sat utterly desolate. A true ghost archipelago, inhabited only by seabirds, iguanas, and the overgrown ruins of Lucayan villages.
But nature and geopolitics abhors a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
A massive, empty chain of islands sitting right next to the main shipping lanes of the wealthiest empire on Earth is not going to stay empty forever. As the 1500s slowly grind into the 1600s, a new geopolitical player enters the Caribbean theater, the English. And they're going to project a completely different kind of ambition onto these coral rocks.
For the first several decades, English interest in the Bahamas was purely predatory and transient. You had famous English privateers, which is really just a legal term for state-sponsored piratesmen like John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake. They utilized the complex, uncharted channels of the empty Bahamas as the perfect hiding spot.
Ambush alley.
Exactly. They would anchor their nimble ships behind a quay, wait for a lumbering Spanish treasure galleon to ride the Gulf Stream past Florida, ambush it, and then vanish back into the shallow reefs where the deep-draft Spanish warships couldn't follow.
But they weren't trying to build towns, they were just using it as an ambush alley.
Right. It wasn't until the mid-1600s that the English actually attempted to settle the Bahamas. And the people who tried were not ruthless pirates looking for plunder. In a wild historical pivot, they were radical, idealistic, religious dreamers looking to build a utopia.
Which brings us to William Sayle and the Eleutherian adventurers. This is such a fascinating, almost unbelievable chapter. We go from a brutal Spanish slave trade to an attempt to build a literal utopian republic. How does that happen?
Well, to understand the motivation behind this utopian experiment, we have to look away from the Caribbean and look at the intense political and religious turmoil happening in England in the 1640s.
The English Civil War.
Yes. England was tearing itself apart in a bloody, protracted conflict between King Charles I and the parliamentarians. And intertwined with this political war was a deep, bitter religious schism between the established, rigid Anglican Church and the radical, dissenting Puritan independents who believed in congregational autonomy and strict Calvinist theology.
And this toxic tension didn't stay in London. It spilled across the Atlantic into England's overseas colonies, specifically the tiny isolated island of Bermuda.
Bermuda had been settled decades earlier and was a relatively prosperous colony, but it mirrored the divisions of the mother country. The majority of Bermudians were staunch royalists, loyal to the king and the Anglican Church. But there was a vocal, growing minority of Puritan independents. William Sayle was a highly prominent figure in Bermuda. He was a wealthy landowner, a ship captain, and had even served as the governor of the island on 3 separate occasions. And crucially, his religious sympathies lay entirely with the dissenting Puritan independents.
So as the Civil War in England intensifies, the royalist majority in Bermuda starts heavily persecuting Sayle and his Puritan faction. They are fining them, denying them the right to worship, basically trying to crush their movement.
The environment became toxic and intolerable. Sayle, realizing they could never achieve religious freedom in Bermuda, decides the only solution is to leave. He wants to find a completely blank slate, an empty land where they can build a new society from scratch, perfectly aligned with their ideals. And where is the nearest large, completely empty tract of land? The ghost archipelago of the Bahamas, sitting just hundreds of miles to the southwest.
So Sayle essentially launches a 17th century startup. In 1647, right in the middle of this massive political upheaval, he travels to London and publishes a broadsheet. It's a promotional flyer, meant to be pinned up in taverns and coffee houses, looking for investors and brave settlers for a brand new colony.
The broadsheet was titled, A Broadside Advertising Eleutheria and the Bahamas Islands. But it was the accompanying legal document, the Articles and Orders of the Company of Eleutherian Adventurers, that is truly astonishing to historians.
Let's break down the mechanics of this document, because if you read it today, it sounds centuries ahead of its time. They weren't just saying, let's go to an island and farm tobacco. They were proposing a radically new, subversive form of government.
They were proposing a republic. Think about how dangerous that was. They are drafting this document while England still officially has a king. Sale and his investors propose a government featuring a single-chamber parliament, a senate composed of 100 members, which would be elected annually by all the freemen of the colony. It was a massive leap toward democratic self-rule.
They also established a very progressive system of equal land distribution to prevent the rise of massive feudal aristocracies like they had in England. But the absolute core of the document, the most radical element of all, was religion, right?
Yes. The articles explicitly enshrined absolute religious freedom, what they call liberty of conscience, as the unshakable foundation of their new society. They stated that no man could be persecuted or prejudiced for his religious opinions, provided he didn't disrupt the civil peace. To solidify this grand vision, they decided to name their first settled island Eleutheria, which is the ancient Greek word for freedom.
It's an incredibly beautiful vision, a true utopia of religious tolerance, democratic self-rule, and egalitarian economics planted on an empty tropical island far away from the wars of Europe. It sounds perfect on paper, so what happened when they actually tried to build it?
It crashed against the rocks, literally and figuratively. In the summer of 1648, William Sale sets out from Bermuda with about 70 eager settlers. This included men, women, children, and a deeply pious 80-year-old Puritan minister named Patrick Copland. They sailed in two ships, a larger supply-laden vessel called the William, and a much smaller, nimble 6-ton boat called a shallop.
So they arrive in the Bahamas, ready to build a paradise of brotherly love. And immediately, almost comically, human nature ruins the whole thing before they even unpack.
The irony is profound. Before they even manage to agree on a permanent site to build their first camp, a massive vitriolic theological dispute breaks out on the ships among these supposedly tolerant Puritans. A rebel faction, led by a man named Captain Butler, decides that Governor Sale is becoming far too dictatorial in his commands.
The people who fled Bermuda to escape tyranny are suddenly accusing their own leader of tyranny.
Exactly. The squabbling becomes so intense that the colony physically fractures before it even begins. Sale, disgusted by the mutiny, decides he cannot build a utopia with Captain Butler. So Sale takes his loyalists, leaves Butler and his faction on a small island, gets back onto the main ship, the William, and sails further up the chain to find a new, separate spot to settle.
And that is exactly when the physical geography of the Bahamas asserts its dominance over human plans.
As the William is navigating the treacherous, uncharted waters near the northern end of Eleutheria, disaster strikes. The ship slams violently into a jagged, submerged coral reef. The hull is torn open.
And the ship goes down.
The ship is entirely lost. Miraculously, only one man drowns. The rest of the settlers manage to scramble ashore. But the true catastrophe is logistical. Absolutely, all of their vital provisions went down with the ship. Their barrels of flour, their carefully preserved seeds for planting, their gunpowder, and most devastatingly, almost all of their iron tools, their axes, saws, and shovels, are resting at the bottom of the ocean.
In the blink of an eye, these lofty, idealistic, utopian philosophers are reduced to starving, desperate castaways.
It is the ultimate, brutal test of their high-minded ideology against the unforgiving reality of the Bahamian ecosystem. You cannot eat a constitution, you cannot clear dense scrub brush or plant crops in solid limestone without iron tools.
The sources mention that their situation became so dire that they were reduced to living inside a massive limestone cave on the island, a place now known as Preacher's Cave.
Yes, they huddled in the cave for shelter from the elements. To survive, they were forced into a desperate, primitive existence, trying to forage for whatever they could scrape from the rocks. They ate sea turtles when they could catch them, foraging for wild berries and conch, constantly teetering on the edge of mass starvation.
Okay, I have to push back here. If you have 70 people, including children and an 80-year-old man living in a cave on a rock, and you have lost all your tools and seeds, how does this tiny failed colony not just starve to death entirely within a month? How did anyone survive to tell the tale?
They survived because William Sale, despite the failure of his utopian vision, was an incredibly resilient and resourceful mariner. Realizing his people were weeks away from death, Sale took that tiny 6-ton boat they still had, the shallop. With a crew of 8 desperate men, he launched that tiny boat out into the open, treacherous waters of the Atlantic Ocean and sailed roughly 700 miles northward to the English colony of Virginia to beg for salvation.
Navigating a 6-ton boat across the open ocean to Virginia is insane, but he makes it. Does Virginia send a rescue fleet to help them build their republic?
Not exactly. Sale managed to secure a larger vessel and some emergency supplies in Virginia, but the Virginian colonists, who were mostly pragmatic, tobacco-growing Anglicans, took one look at Sale's radical Republican constitution and politely declined to join the venture. Sale returned to Eleutheria with just enough food to keep his people alive for a little while longer.
But the real salvation, the relief effort that actually saves the colony from total collapse, comes from a very surprising historical connection.
It does. Word of the starving Eleutherian castaways eventually reached New England, specifically the deeply Puritan communities of Massachusetts. These New Englanders viewed the Eleutherians as their spiritual brethren, fellow dissenting independents suffering for their faith in the wilderness. Moved by religious solidarity, the churches of Boston and surrounding towns organized a massive, community-funded relief effort.
They took up a collection.
A massive one. They raised roughly 800 pounds, which was an absolute fortune in the 17th century chartered ships, loaded them with corn, beef, and essential supplies, and sent them south to the Bahamas.
It essentially saved the Eleutherian colony from being wiped out. But the way the Eleutherians showed their gratitude for this rescue is honestly one of the greatest pieces of historical trivia I have ever read.
It is a wonderful connection. So the Eleutherians are saved from starvation. They realize they have no money to repay the massive debt to Massachusetts, but they realize they do have one resource growing wild on their harsh island that is highly valuable in Europe: Braziletto wood.
What is Braziletto wood?
It's a dense, heavy tropical hardwood that, when boiled, produces a brilliant, highly prized red dye used in the European textile industry. So the Eleutherians, likely using tools they managed to salvage from the wrecked William or acquired from Sale's trip to Virginia, spend months laboriously chopping down 10 tons of this heavy Braziletto wood.
They load these 10 tons of wood onto a ship and send it back north to Boston. But they don't just say, here's payment for the corn. They include a specific letter of instruction for what to do with the profits.
The letter instructed that the wood should be sold in the market, and the proceeds should not go to the investors, but it should be given as a gift to support a fledgling, struggling little theological school located across the river in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And that struggling little school was Harvard College.
Exactly. The sale of the Bahamian Braziletto wood realized $124. At that specific time in Harvard's history, it was the largest single philanthropic endowment the college had ever received. So you could draw a direct historical line. The early survival and growth of Harvard University was significantly funded by the desperate gratitude of a failed, starving utopian colony in the Bahamas.
That is just brilliant. But back down in the Bahamas, despite the rescue, the grand utopian dream was effectively dead. Yes, the Eleutherians survived physically, but mere survival doesn't automatically build a thriving, enlightened republic. Over the next 20 years, the original, highly educated, idealistic foundersmen, like the 80-year-old Minister Copland, either died of old age or, like William Sale himself, eventually gave up on the harsh conditions and sailed back to the comforts of Bermuda.
The brain drain was total, and you had to look at who was left behind. The people who stayed in the Bahamas were the poorest, the most stubborn, or the most adaptable, and to survive, they had to completely abandon the dream of being pious farmers, because the geology simply wouldn't allow it.
So what is the mechanism of their survival? If they aren't farming, how do they make a living?
They turned entirely to the sea, becoming scavengers. They combed the beaches looking for ambergris, which is a highly valuable waxy substance secreted in the intestines of sperm whales, used as a fixative in European perfumes. They cut down the remaining Braziletto wood. But increasingly, their primary industry became racking.
Racking, which is a polite term for aggressively salvaging goods from the numerous ships that continually crashed onto the treacherous Bahamian reefs.
It was a deeply unreliable boom or bust economy. You might starve for 6 months, and then a Spanish galleon full of silver, silk, and rum tears its bottom out on the reef, and suddenly you are rich. This lifestyle fundamentally altered the psychology of the colony. It bred a society that was rough, cynical, hardy, and completely independent. They were no longer pious philosophers debating parliamentary structure. They were barefoot beachcombers willing to fight over a salvaged barrel of wine.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the next and arguably most chaotic phase of Bahamian history, the slide into absolute ungovernable lawlessness. By 1670, the population of the Bahamas had grown to about 1,100 people. They had expanded off Eleutheria and formed a new central settlement on an island they called New Providence, which is where the modern capital of Nassau sits today. But they had absolutely no official government, no laws, no courts, and zero military protection. They were just a loose band of scavengers.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Into this lawless void stepped a group of men operating from the absolute highest echelons of English society, the Lord's Proprietor.
Right. In 1670, King Charles II of England officially signs a royal charter granting total ownership of the entire Bahamian archipelago to 6 incredibly powerful English nobles, known as the Lord's Proprietor of the Carolinas.
These were men who lived in opulence in London palaces, men like the Duke of Albemarle and the Earl of Shaftesbury. They viewed the Bahamas not as a place to build a society, but strictly as a feudal fiefdom, a business venture. Their operating philosophy was simple: extract maximum wealth from the colony through taxes and monopolies while spending absolutely zero of their own money to develop or protect it.
Just to highlight how cheap they were, the historical sources show that in their first few years of managing this entire country, these 6 fabulously wealthy dukes and earls spent a grand total of 495 fives on the Bahamas. That is aggressively, insultingly cheap.
It was the absolute worst kind of absentee landlordism. They wanted the profits of an empire without bearing any of the costs. But the most absurd, almost comical aspect of their rule was the legal framework they tried to impose on these rough-and-tumble Bahamian salvagers from 3,000 miles away.
This is one of the wildest historical cameos I've ever encountered. Lord Shaftesbury, one of the proprietors, has his personal friend and secretary draft the official constitution for the Bahamas. And that friend was none other than John Locke.
The John Locke, the towering philosopher of the Enlightenment, the man who essentially invented classical liberalism, the thinker whose writings on life, liberty, and property would directly inspire the American Declaration of Independence a century later. He sat in a comfortable room in London and wrote the Constitution for the Bahamas.
It is hilarious. I am trying to picture the mechanism of this working. You have Locke designing a government featuring a grand council, a complex parliament, intricate systems of deputies and courts, and a structured system for levying taxes on all visiting ships.
Right.
It's like hiring the world's greatest software architect to design a cutting-edge, complex operating system, and then you try to install it on a wooden abacus. You have Locke designing this intricate, aristocratic parliamentary system for 1,000 barefoot, rum-drinking beachcombers whose main industry was stealing wet cargo from sinking ships. It was destined to fail instantly.
And fail. It did, spectacularly. The physical reality of the Bahamas simply could not support Locke's grand political architecture. You cannot collect taxes from people who survive by secretly bartering salvaged goods on isolated beaches.
No.
The proprietors, frustrated by the lack of profits, sent a series of governors from London to try and enforce Locke's laws. These governors were universally either corrupt, incompetent, or completely ignored by the locals.
So a great example of this dysfunction is Governor John Wentworth.
Wentworth was an interesting choice. He was an aristocrat. He was a rough sea captain who happened to be popular with some of the locals. The proprietors named him governor, hoping he could control the mob. But soon, furious complaints from rival islanders flooded back to London.
The ambitious guys who wanted his job started writing letters.
Exactly. One rival wrote a scathing report to the proprietors, accusing Governor Wentworth of utterly debauching the people. He claimed Wentworth encouraged the settlers to drink heavily, ignore their meager farms, and take to their small boats to go run a coasting.
Run a coasting. I love that term. It's essentially a polite 17th century euphemism for early piracy, isn't it?
That's exactly what it was. The Bahamians realized that waiting for ships to crash on the reef was inefficient. Running a coasting meant sailing out into the shipping lanes, actively looking for vulnerable, damaged, or lightly armed merchant ships, and aggressively salvaging their cargo before they ever hit a reef. Under Wentworth, the line between beachcomber and pirate dissolved entirely.
So the proprietors in London finally realize Wentworth is a massive liability. He's not collecting taxes. He's running a pirate haven, so they fire him. And they decide they need to send a hardliner, a strict, no-nonsense governor, to bring these rowdy Bahamians to heel. So they send a man named Charles Chillingworth.
Governor Chillingworth arrives in New Providence, determined to enforce John Locke's constitution, establish order, and finally extract some tax revenue for the dukes in London.
And how do the independent, scavenging Bahamians react to this strict new boss demanding their money?
With a complete, unified, and violent rejection of external authority. Chillingworth tried to lay down the law. The Bahamians simply refused to listen. When he tried to force the issue, the settlers assembled, physically seized Governor Chillingworth, dragged him onto a waiting ship, and summarily deported him to Jamaica.
They literally picked up the royal governor and threw him off the island.
They deported their own head of state. And according to a contemporary historian writing shortly after the event, once Chillingworth was gone, the Bahamians went back to living, quote, every man as he thought best for his pleasure and interest.
Which is an incredibly polite Enlightenment-era way of describing total anarchic chaos.
If we connect this event to the broader historical picture, this conical act of rebellion is the crucial turning point. By violently rejecting organized, absentee government from London, these hardy survivors inadvertently set a trap that would change maritime history.
How so?
Think about what they created. They established a massive power vacuum in a highly strategic location right next to the richest shipping lanes in the world. And this location is inhabited by a population that is already deeply comfortable with the like of arms scavenging on the high seas, with no navy or police force to stop them.
They didn't just reject a governor, they built the perfect, ready-made incubator for the golden age of piracy. The legendary figures Blackbeard, Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, they are just over the historical horizon, and they're going to be drawn to this exact lawless vacuum in Nassau like a magnet.
Exactly. The failure of the utopian dreamers, followed by the failure of the aristocratic proprietors, ensured that the Bahamas would inevitably become the pirate capital of the globe.
It is an absolutely unbelievable historical arc we've covered today. When you step back and look at it, the sheer scope of change is staggering. We started with the sheer geologic weirdness of these islands. Massive underwater mountains slowly topped with trillions of coral polyps over ice ages, creating a landscape that possessed no rivers and demanded total adaptation from anyone trying to survive on its porous rock.
We saw the gentle Lucayans successfully conquer that brutal environment, developing complex sports, incredible maritime technology, and a rich cosmology, only to be utterly, tragically wiped out by the brutal economic hunger of the Spanish Empire in a matter of just 2 decades.
A tragedy of immense, almost unfathomable proportions that left an area larger than Jamaica completely empty, a silent ghost archipelago. And then, the bizarre attempt by the Eleutherian adventurers to build a literal utopian republic on those empty rocks, an experiment in pure religious and political freedom that was starved to death by the harsh reality of the coral limestone and only saved by chopping dyewood to fund Harvard University.
An experiment which finally, inevitably, degraded into a society of cynical, hard-bitten scavengers who were so aggressively independent they threw their own royal governor off the island, paving the way for the pirates. It raises such a profound, lingering question about the nature of these islands, and perhaps about human endeavor in general. Throughout this early history, the Bahamas acted as a blank canvas where powerful empires and ambitious individuals tried to project their deepest, most desperate desires.
That's a great way to frame it. Columbus and Spain looked at the Bahamas and tried to project their desire for endless gold and a disposable, compliant labor force. Ponce de Leon sailed through trying to project a mythological desire for eternal youth. Imagine you're a Spanish soldier in the spring of 1783.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right, so you're stationed in Nassau, and you're looking through a brass spyglass from the ramparts of this massive stone fort.
And geopolitically, the world is a total mess right now.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
The American Revolution has basically turned the entire hemisphere upside down, and you, the Spanish, are currently occupying this British colony.
Right, which was a huge prize.
Exactly. So out on the turquoise water, you see the absolute nightmare scenario. A fleet of ships has just dropped anchor, just out of cannon range.
The worst thing a garrison soldier can see.
Totally. And hundreds of hostile troops are loading into these little rowboats, but as they get closer, you see they are painted like indigenous warriors.
Which, if you know anything about 18th century European military psychology, is terrifying.
Yeah, garrison troops are absolutely terrified of indigenous warfare tactics. So the boats hit the shore, the troops disembark, and, well, you surrender.
You just hand over the keys to the colony.
Right. You hand them over, only to realize, like an hour later, that you just capitulated to a 20-something-year-old kid from South Carolina.
It's so embarrassing.
A handful of ragged militia and a fleet of rowboats filled with, literally, straw dolls dressed in uniforms. Welcome to the deep dive.
It is, hands down, the ultimate theatrical heist of the 18th century.
It really is, orchestrated by a young loyalist named Andrew DeVoe.
And I think it perfectly encapsulates the bizarre reality of the Bahamas during this era. We tend to project this modern image onto the islands, you know?
Yeah, serene, static, like a postcard of leisure and resorts.
Exactly. But the actual historical landscape from, say, the late 1600s up to 1834, it is a crucible of extreme political volatility.
And environmental failure.
Oh, massive environmental failure, along with just brilliant, chaotic improvisation.
So today we are unpacking a 150-year span of Bahamian history, and we're working from an incredibly rich stack of sources.
Right, primary logs, colonial records, really detailed historical analyses.
Yeah, and these sources track this crazy transition from an absolute vacuum of authority, like a literal pirate republic, through these comic opera military invasions.
Right up to a massive demographic transformation that fundamentally altered the DNA of the islands.
And the reason this specific chunk of time matters for you, the listener, is because you just cannot understand the modern Bahamas without it.
No, you really can't.
Like the architecture of Nassau, the cultural resilience, the unique political structures, it all comes from understanding how this society was forged under immense pressure.
And the foundational pressure really being an utter absence of functional governance.
Yeah, let's start there, the late 1600s.
It is a textbook example of failed colonial venture capitalism.
Yeah.
The British Crown had essentially leased the islands to these guys called the Lords Proprietors.
Right, these aristocrats sitting in London.
Exactly. And they view the colony merely as a speculative real estate asset.
Just a line on a ledger.
Pretty much. So they appointed proprietary governors to manage it, but they provided zero military backing and zero infrastructure funding.
Which creates a fascinating and really dangerous geopolitical vulnerability.
You have an underfunded middle manager sitting on a sparsely populated rock.
Right, a rock that happens to be positioned directly adjacent to the most lucrative shipping lanes in the entire world.
The Spanish treasure routes.
Exactly. And these governors quickly realize they have no actual economy, so they start improvising.
Which is always a dangerous word in colonial politics.
Oh, absolutely. So take Robert Clark. He becomes governor in 1682, and he decides to unilaterally conduct his own rogue foreign policy.
As one does.
Right. He starts issuing letters of marque to buccaneers, like this captain named Coxon.
Now, we should clarify. In a time of war, a letter of marque is standard. It's state-sponsored privateering.
But England and Spain were ostensibly at peace in 1682.
Right. So Clark is essentially handing out government licenses for terrorism.
He claimed it was justified under the, quote, laws of nature because the Spanish had occasionally harassed English ships.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation.
Yeah.
Clark was treating international diplomacy like a neighborhood noise dispute.
Yeah, he just assumed London's protection would magically extend to his totally unsanctioned piracy.
And the proprietors back in London were horrified when they found out. They immediately fired him.
They send a guy named Robert Lilburne to replace him.
But the bureaucratic wheels of the 17th century moved far too slowly to stop the kinetic reality on the ground.
No, they didn't have email. By 1684, the Spanish authorities in Havana had already organized a massive, highly disciplined retaliation.
And when you look at the military logistics of this retaliation, it wasn't just a punitive raid.
No, it was an eradication protocol.
Exactly. The Spaniard force, commanded by Don Juan de Larco, didn't just sail casually into Charlestown, which, by the way, was the early name for Nassau.
Right, Charlestown.
They landed 150 highly trained, hand-picked men. This was a surgical strike against a completely unprepared civilian and buccaneer population.
And the total collapse of English leadership in that specific moment is just staggering.
It's pathetic, really. Governor Lilburne, the new guy, he later wrote that he heard gunfire at a local tavern called the Wheel of Fortune.
And his response wasn't to, rally a defense.
No, he literally fled into the woods to hide.
Just ran away. Meanwhile, the former governor, Robert Clark, actually went out to investigate the disturbance.
And that didn't go well for him. He was wounded, captured, and taken back to Havana.
Where, according to the accounts of later colonial officials, the Spanish literally roasted him on a spit.
Yeah, which is brutal. And whether that's historical fact or just a piece of localized propaganda designed to terrify the English, the psychological effect was exactly the same.
Terrifying. The Spanish plundered the town of 20,000 pounds, which was an astronomical sum for a frontier settlement back then.
And a subsequent raid burned whatever remaining structures there were to the ground. They took women, children, and enslaved people back to Cuba.
Leaving the Bahamas essentially depopulated, just a destitute, smoking ruin.
But a ruin with unparalleled geographic value.
Right. Which creates a vacuum that attracts an entirely different breed of opportunist.
Yeah, before the actual institutional pirates take over, you have this surreal interlude of just extreme treasure hunting.
Oh, William Phipps in 1687. This is wild. This is where technological history intersects with the sheer economic desperation of the era.
Phipps gets backing to search for a wrecked Spanish galleon somewhere between Tortuga and the Turks Islands.
And he's not just free diving, holding his breath. He employs a primitive diving bell invented by a guy from Bermuda.
The mechanics of that diving bell are absolutely fascinating.
It's basically a wooden barrel, right?
Essentially, yeah. An inverted wooden water cask is heavily weighted so it would sink vertically. That way, it trapped a pocket of compressed air inside.
So a diver could swim down, duck into the cask to take a breath, and then swim out to scavenge the wreck.
Exactly. And then return to the bell for another breath. But it was incredibly dangerous.
Oh, dealing with atmospheric pressure changes and carbon dioxide buildup.
Right. With a zero modern understanding of decompression sickness, they were just winging it.
But the risk-to-reward ratio was off the charts.
Yeah.
Because they actually find the galleon.
And using this rudimentary air pocket, they haul up 26 tons of silver.
26 tons. The investors back in London saw a 10,000% return on their capital.
Phipps gets knighted. His wife gets a gold cup worth 1,000 pounds.
But the crucial point here, the real economic mechanics of colonialism, is that absolutely none of that wealth remains in the Bahamas to rebuild the infrastructure.
None of it. The local population is still starving, attempting to scrape by on subsistence farming in terrible, terrible soil.
And this structural poverty breeds a very specific kind of local tyranny.
Because the proprietors still refuse to invest, right? So the governorship becomes a magnet for despots who view the office purely as an extortion racket.
Enter Cadwallader Jones.
Cadwallader Jones. He arrives in 1690, and the institutional hijacking he pulls off is breathtaking.
The colonial records literally describe him as an unprincipled ruffian.
A great phrase. He doesn't even bother with the legal formality of proclaiming the new monarchs, William and Mary.
Right, he just sets up a straight-up dictatorship. He consolidates all the executive power.
He names himself governor, treasurer, provost marshal, and colonial secretary. All at once.
He controls the money, the law enforcement, and the records. Total monopoly.
And he actively cultivates the pirate element as his personal enforcement arm.
Which is insane. He actually sells them the colony's gunpowder.
Essentially disarming the honest citizens so he could supply the outlaws.
And when those honest citizens finally organize and demand a General Assembly to establish some kind of legal framework, Jones doesn't just veto it.
No, he goes full supervillain.
He has his son row out to a ship in the harbor and physically train its cannons directly onto the council chamber.
To force them to pass his own despotic laws. It is ruled by direct kinetic threat.
And when the citizens actually manage to rebel later on and put Jones in irons, the institutional rot is so deep that it doesn't even matter.
Right, because a mob of his pirate cronies just breaks him out a month later by force of arms.
And the legal retribution he enacts afterward is a masterclass in corrupt jurisprudence.
Oh, it's a joke. The man who prosecuted Jones is thrown into a dungeon for 485 days.
And when Jones finally puts that prosecutor on trial, he completely stacks the grand jury.
He doesn't just pick loyalists. He selects 6 known pirates, 2 men known for habitual drunkenness, and a man openly accused of, quote, unnatural vice.
He engineered a jury that was completely immune to legal or moral reasoning.
Which sends a very clear signal to the entire Atlantic world. Nassau is no longer a functioning colony. It is a safe haven.
Yeah, by the mid-1690s, the governors aren't just tolerating pirates. They are entering into active, highly lucrative joint ventures with them.
And the real turning point for this is the arrival of Henry Avery in 1696.
Avery had just executed the heist of the century. He captured the Ganges Sawai, which was the massive flagship of the Great Mogul of India.
Aurangzeb. We're talking about a ship carrying 100,000 pieces of 8 precious stones and the Mogul's own family.
Avery triggers a massive geopolitical crisis with this. The Mogul threatens to expel the entire British East India Company in retaliation.
So Avery is suddenly the most wanted man on the planet. And he sails his ship, the Fancy, right into Nassau, looking for a place to launder the money.
He approaches Governor Nicholas Trott. Now, Trott knows exactly who Avery is and the diplomatic nightmare he represents.
But Trott is looking at the sheer mathematics of the situation. Nassau only has 60 able-bodied men in the militia.
And Avery has a heavily armed crew.
So Trott can't stop him militarily. But more importantly, he just doesn't want to.
Because the bribes are staggering. Trott negotiates a cover charge for the entire crew.
20 pieces of 8 for every pirate that steps ashore, 40 for Avery himself, and he gets the ship itself, which was loaded with plunder.
We have the actual testimony where it's revealed Trott received 1,000 pounds in goods, including massive elephant tusks.
Elephant tusks sitting in a wooden shack in the Bahamas.
The absurdity of that wealth transfer is just mind-boggling.
But Trott's accommodation of Avery really institutionalizes Nassau as the pirate republic.
Yeah, over the next 2 decades, the population of pirates just swells.
By 1713, following the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, thousands of suddenly unemployed naval sailors and privateers fled into the Caribbean.
Because they have no other way to make a living. The Bahamas becomes the epicenter of this explosion.
You have Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, and of course, Edward Teach.
Blackbeard.
Blackbeard.
Now, Blackbeard is the defining myth of this era. The cinematic image is this demonic force of nature, right?
He's plaiting his beard with ribbons. He's wearing burning slow matches under his hat in battle.
He's carrying 6 brace of pistols. But looking at the actual logistics of piracy, I really have to wonder about the utility of all that.
How much of it was real versus theater?
Exactly. Was Teach actually this brilliant tactical mastermind, or did he just understand that in the piracy business, violent theatricality is way cheaper than actual combat?
That is the exact distinction we have to make. Actual naval combat broadsides, cannon fire, is disastrous for a pirate.
Yeah, it damages the prize you were trying to steal.
It damages your own ship, which you have no shipyard to repair, and it risks your crew.
So Blackbeard's genius wasn't naval tactics, it was psychological warfare and personal branding.
The historical Edward Teach was actually smaller than the giant of legend, and his time as an independent captain lasted barely 2 years.
The myth vastly outpaces the career, and when you read his actual logbook, it shatters that glamorous cinematic illusion completely.
He's not living like a king on the high seas.
No. The log literally reads, "Rum all out. Our company somewhat sober. A damned confusion amongst us. Rogues applauding, great talk of separation, so I looked sharp for a prize."
It reads like the diary of a deeply stressed middle manager dealing with a hostile union.
It totally does. Pickings were getting incredibly lean because the pirate population in the Caribbean had saturated the market.
The supply of vulnerable merchant ships just couldn't keep up with the demand of thousands of pirates.
So Teach maintained control of his increasingly desperate, sober, and mutinous crew through calculated acts of psychological terror.
Like the famous brimstone in the hole drinking game.
Yeah, this is crazy. He literally takes his key crew members down into the ship's hold, lights trays of sulfur, locks the hatches.
And just sees who can withstand the suffocating smoke the longest.
He tells them they're making their own hell to see who is closest kin to the devil.
And it serves a very specific organizational purpose. He emerges last, coughing up a lung, but he has physically demonstrated that he is willing to endure more pain and go closer to death than anyone else on the ship.
It enforces a hierarchy based on sheer sociopathy.
But a societal model built on sociopathy and stolen goods is fundamentally unsustainable.
The Crown finally realizes they can't just send another aristocratic bureaucrat to fix this.
No, they need someone who understands the logistics of maritime violence.
They need Woodes Rogers, and his arrival in 1718 is a massive pivot point.
Rogers isn't a politician. He's a highly successful privateer. He'd actually circumnavigated the globe.
He's the guy who rescued Alexander Selkirk, the real-life Robinson Crusoe, off an island in the Pacific.
So he has immense credibility with these seafaring men. He arrives in Nassau, armed with the king's pardon.
Which was a blanket amnesty for any pirate who surrenders by a certain date.
But the logistics of executing this pardon are incredibly tense. Rogers drops anchor with a small fleet.
The vast majority of the pirates in Nassau, exhausted by the lifestyle, are ready to take the deal.
But Charles Vane, representing the hardliners, refuses. And the physics of his escape are terrifying.
Yeah, in the dead of night, Vane takes a captured French prize ship, loads it with combustibles, sets it on fire.
And sends it sailing directly into Rogers' anchored fleet.
A fire ship in a crowded harbor is a complete nightmare. It's an unguided missile.
If it catches the rigging of one of Rogers' ships, the fire spreads instantly, the gunpowder magazines ignite, and the entire expedition is over before it begins.
Exactly. Rogers' ships are forced to frantically cut their anchor cables and maneuver out of the way of this floating inferno.
And in the chaos, Vane escapes in a swift, shallow draft sloop, hoisting the skull and crossbones.
And he actually fires a cannon in derision at the Royal Navy as he slips over the reef.
But Rogers doesn't chase him. He stays focused on the objective.
He lands, reads the pardon, and immediately transitions from a naval commander to basically a public health and infrastructure manager.
Which was desperately needed. The physical state of Nassau is appalling. It's a shantytown built on a swamp.
So Rogers forces the newly pardoned pirates to cut back the brush, clean the roads, and rebuild the ruined fort.
Which triggers a devastating epidemiological crisis.
The Caribbean is a notoriously hostile disease environment for Europeans anyway.
And disturbing the soil and swamp water exposed Rogers' men to malaria and yellow fever. Within weeks, 86 of his soldiers die.
Rogers himself falls desperately ill, and the pardoned pirates just detest the manual labor.
They are grumbling about taking over the island again and returning to piracy.
This sets up the ultimate test of Rogers' administrative authority, the trial of John Augur in late 1718.
Augur was a pirate who had accepted the king's pardon, but the moment Rogers sent him out on a supply run, Augur mutinied and returned to piracy.
Rogers knows that if he lets this slide, the pardon is completely meaningless, and the Republic of Pirates returns.
So Rogers exercises extreme legal authority. He dispatches a crew of reliable ex-pirates men who had actually committed to the pardon to hunt Augur down.
They capture him and his crew. Rogers convenes a formal Court of Admiralty sessions.
This is crucial because, previously, colonial governors didn't always have the strict legal authority to try and execute pirates without sending them back to London.
Right, but Rogers ensures the legal mechanics are airtight. He tries them, convicts them, and hangs them right on the ramparts.
The psychological impact of that is massive. He even allows the condemned men 3/4 of an hour to sing psalms under the gallows before kicking away the ladders.
It's a brutal demonstration of the state monopoly on violence. The pirate era in Nassau is effectively terminated.
But here is the structural flaw in colonial administration that just blows my mind.
Yeah, Rogers completely stabilizes the geopolitical situation. He repels a Spanish invasion in 1720, and he builds a functional society.
And the investors in London completely abandon him.
Why? Why would they do that?
Because the financial structure of the colony was completely misaligned with the reality of governing it. The venture capitalists in London were expecting immediate dividends.
Like sugar, cotton, gold.
Exactly. When Rogers' letters arrived detailing the need for constant capital expenditure to maintain the fort and feed the garrison, the investors simply stopped reading them.
They refused to honor his drafts. So Rogers was forced to spend 11,000 pounds of his own personal fortune just to keep the colony from starving.
He essentially subsidized the British Empire out of his own pocket.
And his reward. He returns to England in 1721 completely bankrupt, and his creditors immediately throw him into a London debtor's prison.
The man who broke the Pirate Republic is locked up for the crime of funding the government.
It's a tragic irony. But he does manage to clear his name eventually. And in a remarkable second act, he is reappointed as governor in 1729.
And this time, he brings with him a mandate to establish the first official House of Assembly.
This is a massive constitutional milestone. It's the transition from arbitrary executive rule to representative government.
But representative government immediately introduces political gridlock.
As it always does. The assembly is elected, and a merchant named John Colebrook manages to get himself elected as speaker.
Colebrook doesn't want to build a nation. He wants to monopolize trade. So he uses the assembly to systematically sabotage Rogers' legislation.
Rogers eventually has to have Colebrook arrested for sedition just to get the government functioning again.
Rogers dies in Nassau in 1732, physically and financially exhausted.
But he leaves the Bahamas firmly under Crown control. The pirates are gone.
The problem is, so is the pirate economy.
Right. Nassau's entire financial ecosystem had been built on fencing stolen Spanish goods.
When you eradicate the pirates, you eradicate the income. The soil is still too poor for large-scale agriculture.
So the colony has to find a new way to survive. which leads them directly into the murky, highly lucrative world of 18th century war profiteering.
To understand how this profiteering worked between 1732 and 1776, you really have to look at the constitutional architecture of the colony.
You have this three-tier system, right?
Right. The governor represents the crown. The council is the upper house, nominated by the governor. And the assembly is the lower house, elected by the local white elite.
And the assembly holds the ultimate trump card, the power of the purse.
Because the crown in London was notoriously cheap, they didn't send a treasury with the governor.
The governor relied on the local assembly to physically vote on and collect the taxes that paid his own salary and funded the government.
This creates a hostage situation. If the governor tries to enforce British trade laws that the local merchants don't like, the assembly simply refuses to pass the supply bill.
They starve the executive branch into submission.
And the governors fight back with sheer administrative tyranny. Take Governor Richard Fitzwilliam, who arrives in 1734.
He tries to break the assembly through outright intimidation.
The colonial records show him calling the Bahamians beasts of burthen to their faces. He claimed they were only fit to be ruled with a rod of iron.
And Fitzwilliam attempted to monetize his office aggressively. There's this story about a massive 32-pound chunk of ambergris being discovered on a beach.
Ambergris being a highly prized secretion from sperm whales, used as a fixative in luxury perfumes. Extremely valuable.
Fitzwilliam bypassed all legal salvage rights and forcibly seized 20% of it for himself.
And when the locals try to take him to court, he weaponizes the judiciary. The mechanics of his intimidation are wild.
If a case he had a financial interest in was being tried, he would literally pace up and down the piazza outside the courthouse,
Scowling through the windows, sending messengers inside to explicitly threaten the judge and the jurymen.
And if the jury somehow still found against him, he would convene the Court of Chancery, which he presided over as chancellor, and simply reverse the judgment.
It was legal absolutism. But despite this toxic political environment, the colony actually begins to prosper economically under the next governor.
John Tinker, who serves from 1738 to 1758.
The engine of this prosperity isn't agriculture or industry, it's international conflict.
The War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War turned the Caribbean into a massive theater of naval warfare.
And Nassau becomes the premier hub for privateering and illicit trade.
Which is a polite way of saying state-sanctioned smuggling. How did the supply chains of this smuggling actually work? Because technically Britain is at war with France and Spain.
It was an incredibly sophisticated gray market. Northern colonial ships from places like Philadelphia or Boston would load up with provisions, flour, timber, manufactured goods.
They would sail to the Bahamas, where the goods were legally unloaded into warehouses.
Then, Bahamian merchants would transship those exact same goods onto smaller vessels and smuggle them into the blockaded French and Spanish ports in places like Hispaniola or Cuba,
trading them for sugar and molasses at exorbitant wartime markups.
So they are actively supplying the military enemies of the British Empire, while simultaneously operating under the protection of the British flag.
It's brilliant treasonous arbitrage. And alongside the smuggling, you have the Vice Admiralty Court in Nassau constantly condemning captured enemy prize ships.
The local officials, the judges, and the merchants are all getting extremely wealthy off the legal fees and the auctioning of confiscated cargoes.
With this massive influx of wealth, they finally realized they need credible infrastructure to protect it. The old forts were just falling apart.
So in 1741, they bring in Peter Henry Bruce, a highly experienced Prussian military engineer, to build Fort Montague.
Bruce arrives and finds a completely degraded defensive posture. The existing cannons are literally buried in the sand.
The gunpowder is spoiled from the humidity, and he has zero skilled labor. There isn't a single trained stonemason in the Bahamas.
So Bruce initiates a massive training program teaching local enslaved people the mechanics of masonry and military engineering.
And the material they are working with is absolutely fascinating from a geological and military standpoint. Bruce utilizes the local Bahamian oolite limestone.
Now, standard European military doctrine required hard granite or brick for forts, right? To shatter incoming cannonballs.
Yes, but oolite is incredibly soft when it's first quarried. You can literally cut it with a handsaw like cheese.
But when it's exposed to the air, it calcifies and hardens.
Exactly, and more importantly, its cellular structure gives it a unique kinetic property.
when a solid iron cannonball fired from a ship hits hard granite, the stone shatters, creating deadly secondary shrapnel that kills the defenders.
But when a cannonball hits Bahamian oolite, the porous rock absorbs the kinetic energy.
The cannonball doesn't shatter the wall, it just sinks into the stone like a baseball hitting a heavy mud bank.
The fort essentially absorbs the bombardment.
It's a brilliantly adapted piece of localized engineering, for Montague is practically indestructible.
But here is the magnificent historical punchline. They build this state-of-the-art fort to keep out the Spanish Navy.
But when the next global conflict erupts, the American Revolution in 1776, the enemy that shows up isn't the Spanish.
It's the brand new, entirely unproven American Navy.
This initiates the era of the comic opera invasions. The strategic situation is this. The Continental Army under George Washington is desperately short on gunpowder.
They receive intelligence that there is a massive stockpile of British powder sitting in Nassau.
So, Commodore Ezekiel Hopkins leads the first ever American naval fleet, a makeshift squadron of converted merchant ships, down to the Bahamas to steal it.
The logistics of this raid should have been a complete disaster. The Americans have no experience with amphibious assault.
But they are saved by the sheer staggering incompetence of the Bahamian governor, Montfort Brown.
The American fleet is spotted miles offshore. They have plenty of warning. Brown is awakened, comes to the door of Government House in his nightshirt, and assesses the situation.
He summons the council, fires 3 alarm cannons, which, hilariously, are the only shots fired during the entire invasion.
And then he makes a fateful decision. As the American forces are actively rowing ashore, Governor Brown abandons the fort.
He later claimed he needed to go home to make himself a little decent, meaning he wanted to put on his formal military uniform before facing the enemy.
He leaves a fortress in the middle of an invasion to go change his clothes.
And while he's gone, the local militia, seeing they have no commanding officer, simply melts away into the town.
When Brown finally returns hours later, completely dressed for a parade, he finds the fort practically empty.
He then writes in his official dispatch that a violent fit of cholic, a stomachache, had delayed him.
It is the ultimate bureaucratic excuse. A stomachache lost the colony.
The Americans simply walk in and take the fort without a single casualty.
They occupy Nassau for 2 weeks, drinking all the captured wine in the governor's cellar.
And then they sail away with 88 cannons, 15 mortars, and thousands of cannonballs, taking Governor Brown with them as a hostage.
It was a bloodless, profoundly embarrassing defeat for the British military apparatus.
It exposes Nassau as completely hollow, and the islands become a geopolitical football. The Spanish eventually capture Nassau in 1782.
But they don't hold it for long, because in 1783, we get the Andrew Devoe heist that we opened the show with.
And the psychological doctrine behind Devoe's deception is really worth unpacking.
Devoe is a young loyalist exile from South Carolina. He has no real army, just a handful of ragged militia and 2 small ships.
While the Spanish garrison occupying Nassau has over 700 regular troops and massive stone forts, a frontal assault is mathematically impossible.
So Devoe leans entirely into asymmetrical psychological warfare.
He anchors just out of range, but clearly within sight of the Spanish spyglasses, and he starts the rowboat trick.
He loads his men into boats. They row toward the shore, appearing to land. But as they near the beach, the men lie completely flat in the bottom of the boats.
The boats are rowed back to the ships, looking completely empty to the Spanish observers.
The men stand back up, climb down into the boats again, and repeat the process.
It creates a visual loop. To the Spanish officers monitoring the landing, it looks like a massive, continuous disembarkation of hundreds, perhaps thousands of troops.
Devoe compounds this by dressing up straw mannequins in uniforms and placing them strategically around his actual men to swell the visible ranks.
But the real kicker, the thing that actually breaks the Spanish morale, is the cultural fear he exploits.
He has his men paint their faces and bodies to look like Native American warriors.
This is a highly calculated move based on colonial military psychology.
European garrison troops in the Americas were deeply terrified of indigenous warfare. They were trained for linear European musketry, not the fluid, often brutal tactics of indigenous raiding parties.
The mere rumor that a massive force of savage warriors was outside the walls was enough to cause panic within the fort.
Devoe fires a single, well-directed cannon shot that smashes through the roof of the governor's house.
He sends in a pompous, highly exaggerated letter demanding immediate surrender to prevent a massacre.
And the Spanish commander, completely paralyzed by the illusion of overwhelming force, capitulates.
The Spanish march out to surrender their weapons, expecting to see an army, and they find a bunch of guys in face paint and some straw dolls.
It is a masterpiece of deception.
But Devoe's victory, while brilliant, accidentally opens the door to the most catastrophic demographic and environmental shift in Bahamian history.
The Loyalist transformation.
With the end of the American Revolution and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the United States is officially independent.
This creates a massive refugee crisis. Tens of thousands of Americans who had remained loyal to the British Crown are forced to flee.
And suddenly, the Bahamas, recently recaptured by Devoe, looks like a viable destination.
We're talking about a demographic earthquake. Roughly 8,000 loyalists, along with the thousands of enslaved people they claim as property, flood into the Bahamas from places like East Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas.
They arrive almost overnight. The population of the islands literally triples.
And the sociological friction this creates is immediate and violent.
You have two completely incompatible cultures colliding. The original Bahamian inhabitants, known as the Conks, had spent generations adapting to the poor environment.
They lived a laid-back, subsistence lifestyle focused on fishing, salvaging shipwrecks, and small-scale farming. They were highly egalitarian by 18th century standards.
And then the Loyalists show up. These are aristocratic, deeply ambitious, former plantation owners.
They are angry about losing the war, they feel the British Crown owes them massive compensation, and they are accustomed to running vast, highly disciplined agricultural estates.
They look at the Conks and see lazy, uncultured peasants.
The Loyalists demand massive land grants, immediate political representation, and total control of the colonial apparatus.
Governor James Maxwell, who is caught in the middle of this, tries to mediate, but the Loyalists are hyper-aggressive.
They form a Board of American Loyalists, which acts as a shadow government. They riot in the streets of Nassau.
If an American merchant ship pulls into the harbor, they violently tear down the new American flag.
The hostility is so intense, the political gridlock so complete, that Governor Maxwell simply gives up. The stress breaks him.
He literally flees the islands in 1785, leaving his deputy to deal with the chaos.
The Loyalists demanded a governor who respected their aristocratic ambitions.
And the Crown, in a moment of either profound cynicism or complete administrative blindness, sends them Lord Dunmore.
Lord Dunmore is a fascinating study in unchecked aristocratic hubris. He was the infamous last royal governor of Virginia, the man who was forced to flee Williamsburg at the dawn of the Revolution.
He arrives in Nassau in 1787, and he hasn't learned a single lesson about colonial management.
He brings all his haughty, despotic tendencies with him. His political enemies described him as an obstinate, violent man acting like the lordly despot of a petty clan.
His approach to governance is pure, unfiltered nepotism. He views the entire colonial bureaucracy as a jobs program for his family.
He appoints one of his sons as a representative in the assembly. He makes another son the colonial agent for the Turks Islands, and then unilaterally promotes him to lieutenant governor without even bothering to consult the colonial office in London.
He treats the massive tracts of Crown land not as a resource for the colony, but as personal patronage to reward his cronies.
Which infuriates the very loyalists who had petitioned for a strong governor. They felt entitled to those lands to build their plantations.
Dunmore's administration becomes defined by bitter, highly personal legal battles, the most famous being the trial of William Wiley.
Wiley was a prominent loyalist lawyer and a fierce critic of Dunmore's corruption.
Dunmore decides to silence him, having him arrested on a blatantly trumped-up charge of calling the Chief Justice a damned liar.
The legal theater of this trial is incredible. The two presiding justices at the trial are transparently Dunmore's political cronies. They have no real legal training.
Wiley's defense counsel realizes the whole thing is a kangaroo court, and he decides to openly mock the bench.
In open court, he advises the two justices to consult with each other before ruling. He says, and this is a direct quote from the record, "Perhaps what one has not in his wig, the other may have in his tail. You would probably consult better over a bottle of brandy."
Consult your tail. It's a stunning display of contempt for the court, reflecting the total breakdown of judicial legitimacy under Dunmore.
But while Dunmore is fighting petty legal battles, he is also plunging the colony into massive debt with a profound architectural obsession.
Dunmore becomes fixated on military engineering, initiating a fort-building mania that completely drains the treasury.
He builds Fort Fincastle, which looks bizarrely like a paddle wheel steamer carved out of stone.
But his magnum opus of financial ruin is Fort Charlotte. The initial budget for Fort Charlotte, approved by the Assembly, was £4,000.
By the time Dunmore was finished expanding it, Adding subterranean dungeons and sprawling ramparts, he had billed the British treasury for over £32,000.
And the crowning irony of this exorbitant expense is the structural incompetence of the design. Dunmore wasn't an engineer.
He built the barracks for the garrison troops on a high ridge immediately adjoining the fort.
A visiting military engineer, Lieutenant Darcy, inspected the site and pointed out a fatal flaw in the geometry of the defenses.
The barracks were placed directly in the line of enfilading fire between the fort's main batteries and the town it was supposed to protect.
Meaning, if an enemy ship actually sailed into the harbor and attacked the town, and the fort opened fire to defend it, the cannons would blast straight through their own barracks, annihilating their own troops.
It is a monument to aristocratic arrogance over practical reality.
But while Dunmore is wasting tens of thousands of pounds on useless limestone, what is happening to the actual economy? The Loyalists imported thousands of enslaved people to build a cotton empire.
And for a very brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed to work. In 1786 and 1787, they discovered that the specific microclimate of the Bahamas was suitable for a highly prized variety known as Sea Island cotton.
They clear-cut the native vegetation across the out-islands, planted thousands of acres, and reaped bumper crops.
Wealth poured in. They built grand Charleston-style plantation houses. They believed they had recreated the agrarian aristocracy of the American South.
But the environmental mechanics of the Bahamas are entirely different from the deep alluvial soils of Georgia or Carolina.
The Bahamian Islands are essentially ancient coral reefs covered by a razor-thin layer of topsoil.
When you clear-cut the native scrub and plant a nutrient-hungry monoculture like cotton, you completely disrupt the nitrogen cycle.
Exactly. The geological reality of a karst limestone landscape reasserted itself. By 1788, the agronomic collapse was absolute.
Without deep soil to hold moisture and lacking enough livestock to produce the massive amounts of manure required to artificially fertilize the fields, the soil suffered rapid, catastrophic exhaustion.
The plants grew weak and spindly, and then the biological hammer fell.
A pest known locally as the chenille bug infested the weakened crops, stripping the cotton fields bare practically overnight.
Within a span of less than a decade, the entire economic foundation of the Loyalist dream evaporates.
Plantations that cost thousands of pounds to establish are entirely abandoned. The white planters either flee to other Caribbean colonies or retreat to Nassau, deeply in debt.
And this leaves us with a profound, brutal irony that leads into the final era of our deep dive.
The Loyalists imported thousands of enslaved Africans to operate a massive industrial plantation system, but the environment itself, the thin soil and the bugs, rejected the plantation model.
Which means the daily reality for the enslaved population in the Bahamas between 1815 and 1834 looked radically different from the horrors of the rest of the Caribbean.
When we study Caribbean slavery, the dominant model is the gang system, utilized on the sugar islands like Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, or Barbados.
Sugar production is highly industrialized and hyper-lethal. Enslaved people were worked in massive, tightly controlled gangs from before dawn until after dusk.
Driven relentlessly by the whip to meet continuous factory-style production quotas, the mortality rates were staggering.
But you can't grow sugar in the Bahamas, and the cotton failed. So the planters who remained had to pivot to a completely different labor model just to survive.
They adopted the task system. And we have an incredible primary source that details exactly how this functioned. The Daily Plantation Journal of Charles Farquharson,
who ran an estate on Watlings Island in the early 1830s. Farquharson's journal provides a granular look at the mechanics of the task system.
Labor was not organized by time, it was organized by output.
Each enslaved person was assigned a specific, measurable daily task. For example, weeding a quarter acre of a field or picking a specific weight of crops.
The crucial psychological and sociological difference is this. Once that daily task was completed to the overseer's satisfaction, the remainder of the day belonged to the enslaved person.
To put it in modern economic terms, the gang system was like grueling, endless factory assembly line work, where your time is entirely owned by the employer.
The task system was more akin to exploitative gig work. You have a strict quota, but you have a tiny sliver of autonomy over how you pace yourself to achieve it.
And what they did with that free time is the foundation of modern Bahamian culture.
Because the masters were essentially broke, they stopped importing expensive provisions. They forced the enslaved population to feed themselves.
The enslaved people utilized their free time to create a highly sophisticated, self-efficient internal economy.
They grew their own food in provision grounds, guinea corn, yams, sweet potatoes. They herded cattle, fished the reefs, and built their own thatched houses.
The plantation morphed from a purely industrial extraction site into a relatively self-contained village.
And this level of spatial and temporal autonomy allowed for a massive degree of cultural retention. Where did these enslaved populations originally come from, and how did they maintain their identity in this environment?
The demographic records indicate a high proportion of the Bahamian enslaved population originated from the more northerly regions of West Africa and Gambia, as well as Central Africa, specifically Angola.
We are talking about Wolof, Malinka, and Mambundu peoples. In a massive sugar colony, the constant influx of new captives and the brutal mortality rate shattered community bonds.
But in the Bahamas, the population was isolated on remote islands, relatively stable, and operating under the task system. This allowed them the breathing room to retain and adapt their cultural structures.
We see this survival clearly in the religious and social practices. There is a retention of animistic belief systems, collectively referred to as Obeah.
This wasn't just magic. It was a complex system of herbalism, spiritual mediation, and psychological authority that operated entirely outside the control of the white masters.
It gave the enslaved community internal leadership and dispute resolution.
And the most vibrant public display of this cultural syncretism is the Junkanoo Parade.
During the 3 days of holiday they were granted at Christmas, the enslaved people would hold elaborate masked dances.
They used materials at hand sponges, leaves, cloth, and danced to the polyrhythmic beats of cowbells and goombay drums made from hollowed wood and goatskin.
Junkanoo wasn't just a party. It was a profound act of cultural resilience, a blending of distinct West African traditions into a new, unifying Afro-Bahamian identity.
But while this vibrant culture is forming on the ground, back in Nassau and in the halls of Parliament in London, the legal architecture of slavery is coming under massive attack.
The British abolitionist movement is gaining immense political traction. London begins pushing the colonies to ameliorate, meaning improve the conditions of, and eventually abolish slavery.
And the Bahamian planters react to this with absolute, furious defiance.
The planters view emancipation not just as an economic loss, but as the total destruction of their social hierarchy. This political tension detonates in 1816 in what becomes known as the Wiley Affair.
And here is William Wiley again, the same lawyer who told the judges to consult their tales 30 years ago.
He is now the Attorney General of the colony, and he has evolved into a staunch abolitionist.
The legal mechanics of the Wiley Affair are a fascinating clash of jurisdictions. A local slave master attempted to permanently deport an enslaved woman named Sue and her child back to the harsher plantations of Georgia.
Wiley intervenes using Crown law. He argued that under specific statutes, while the master could perhaps deport her husband, he could not legally sever Sue from the Bahamas against her will without proper cause.
The local assembly, entirely controlled by planters, goes ballistic. They see the Attorney General using British law to undermine their absolute property rights.
So they summon Wiley to answer for his actions. Wiley, knowing it's a trap, refuses to appear.
And the assembly takes an unprecedented step. They dispatch the provost marshal to physically arrest the Attorney General of the colony and throw him in the common jail for contempt.
It creates an instant constitutional crisis. You have the local legislative branch imprisoning the highest legal officer of the executive branch.
The Chief Justice of the Bahamas has to step in, issuing a writ of habeas corpus, the fundamental legal principle demanding a person cannot be detained without lawful justification, to force the jailer to release Wiley.
The assembly responds by censuring the Chief Justice and attempting to rearrest Wiley.
The situation is so toxic, the armed militia is patrolling the streets, that the governor is forced to completely dissolve the assembly. The government essentially shuts down.
The Wiley Affair proves to London that the local planters are completely irrational on the subject of slavery. They are willing to destroy their own government rather than cede an inch of control over their human property.
But the planters are fighting the tide of history. Parliament overrides local objections and forces through the Amelioration Acts between 1824 and 1829.
These are gradualist reforms, but they fundamentally alter the legal status of the enslaved. For the first time, enslaved people in the Bahamas are granted the legal right to own land and personal property.
They are granted the right to formal, legally recognized marriage.
And crucially, the right to give evidence in court. Now, it was heavily restricted. An enslaved person had to have a certificate of religious instruction from a clergyman just to take the oath.
And if a court decided they committed perjury, the punishment was brutal, often severe public flogging. But the legal barrier, that said a black person's word meant nothing against a white person's was finally breached.
Yet, arguably, the most profound shift in the lives of the enslaved population during this twilight era of slavery wasn't legislative, it was theological.
It was the explosive rise of the dissenting churches.
The established Anglican Church, which was the church of the colonial elite, largely ignored the enslaved population.
The planters actively discouraged Anglican priests from proselytizing to their slaves, terrified that hearing biblical messages about the equality of souls before God would spark a rebellion.
This systemic neglect created a massive spiritual vacuum. And that vacuum was rapidly filled by dissenting Protestant denominations. First, the Methodists, led by missionaries like Reverend William Turton, but most significantly, the Baptists.
The success of the Baptist movement is extraordinary, and it wasn't driven by white missionaries from London. It was spearheaded by black preachers who arrived with the Loyalist men like Prince Williams and Sambo Scriven.
They established their own autonomous chapels, completely independent of white colonial control. But beyond the autonomy, why did the Baptist theology resonate so deeply and so quickly with the Afro-Bahamian population?
It comes down to the mechanics of the liturgy. The Anglican service is rigidly hierarchical, text-based, and emotionally reserved. It demands passive observance.
The Baptist worship style, particularly as developed by these black preachers, emphasized direct, visceral participation.
It relied on call and response singing, ecstatic preaching, and the physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit through possession and baptism by full immersion.
Which maps perfectly onto the suppressed African religious expressions that had survived through Obeah and the communal dances of Junkanoo.
The Baptist Church provided a socially acceptable, structurally familiar, and deeply emotional framework for communal gathering and spiritual release.
It wasn't just a religion, it became the central organizing institution of Afro-Bahamian identity, completely bypassing the authority of the slave master.
And that institutional strength is what allowed the Afro-Bahamian community to weather the eventual highly flawed transition into full emancipation in 1834, moving from legal property to a marginalized but fiercely independent peasantry.
This has been an incredibly dense, fascinating journey. Let's pull back and look at the whole picture.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started in the late 1600s with a colony so neglected that its governors were acting like rogue warlords, roasting on Spanish spits and stacking juries with pirates.
We moved through the brilliant, cynical logistical management of Blackbeard and the desperate, bankrupt heroism of Woodes Rogers.
We saw an entire 18th century economy built on the legal fiction of smuggling and the kinetic absorption of limestone forts.
We witnessed the comic opera failures of governors in nightshirts, leading to the demographic shock of the Loyalists, whose grand aristocratic ambitions were literally eaten by bugs and starved by the karst rock.
And finally, we saw how the failure of that plantation economy birthed a task system that allowed an enslaved population to forge a resilient, deeply syncretic culture.
It is a masterclass in adaptation under extreme duress.
So, to you, the listener, the next time you see that postcard of the Bahamas, or you're walking past the pink colonial architecture of Nassau, or touching the porous, cannonball-absorbing stone of Fort Charlotte, remember the mechanics of what you were actually looking at.
You are standing on the remnants of piratical extortion, constitutional hostage-taking, rampant wartime smuggling, and the grueling, brilliantly adapted survival of thousands of enslaved people.
The Serene Paradise is a modern fiction. The historical reality is wonderfully, brutally complex.
And I'll leave you with this final provocative paradox to mull over. We spent a lot of time discussing the failure of the Bahamian soil, how it was too thin for sugar, how it collapsed under the weight of Loyalist cotton.
Historically, poor soil is viewed as a colonial disaster.
But in the Bahamas, it was actually the poverty of the dirt that saved the enslaved population from the absolute worst extremes of the Caribbean death camps. Because the islands physically could not support the brutal, hyper-industrial agriculture of a gang system, the enslaved people were forced into self-sufficiency.
And it was exactly that self-sufficiency born from poor geology that inadvertently granted them the spatial and temporal autonomy to forge the vibrant Afro-Bahamian culture that truly defines the independent nation today.
In a profound historical irony, the very rock that bankrupted the masters ultimately sheltered the culture of the enslaved.
A geographical failure that birthed a cultural triumph. This has been one of the most surprising historical landscapes we've explored. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you on the next one.
Okay, let's unpack this. Picture this. It's the early 1980s. You are a barefoot fisherman from this sleepy little settlement called Sandy Point in the Bahamas.
Right.
You make your living hauling conch, maybe some snapper out of the shallows. It's a quiet, totally unremarkable life. Until one day, you and your crew stumble upon a small twin-engine plane that has just crash-landed in the shallow waters near your settlement.
Just sitting there in the water.
Exactly. So you wade out to it, you pry open the door with cutlasses, and you find it packed to the absolute ceiling with Colombian cocaine.
The street value of which would be, I mean, it would be astronomical, even by today's standards, let alone back in the 1980s.
Yeah, insane money. So what do? Well, if you're these particular fishermen, you steal it.
Wow.
You hide it, you figure out how to sell it to the cartels that come looking for it, and overnight, you become multimillionaires. You take your newfound wealth, head to Florida, and start partying like royalty.
Buying cars they don't even know how to drive, splashing $100 bills at luxury hotels.
Right. And eventually you end up as global fugitives, hiding out in terror from both the FBI and mafia hitmen.
It sounds like, a Hollywood script.
Right.
But it's documented fact pulled straight from the sworn testimony of a massive commission of inquiry.
It's wild.
And that wild transition, right, from an impoverished, isolated fisherman to a millionaire caught in a global vice trade, it's the perfect microcosm for the entire history we are unpacking today.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive stack of historical research, sworn testimonies, and political archives to trace the absolutely roller coaster history of the Bahamas.
We are looking at a very specific, highly transformative window.
From 1834 to 1985, our mission today is to figure out how this nation went from the abolition of slavery to an independent modern country grappling with the violent fallout of the international drug trade.
And to understand that journey, you really have to throw away the traditional metrics of national wealth. Because usually when analyzing a country's economic foundation, we look for tangible assets, right?
Like things you can touch or sell.
Exactly. We look for deep water ports, sprawling tracts of fertile soil, vast mineral deposits. We look at the dirt itself and what can be extracted from it.
But when you look at a map of the Bahamas, you realize their greatest, most lucrative, and frankly most dangerous asset wasn't anything they could dig out of the ground.
No, it wasn't.
It was simply where they were, just coordinates on a map, a scattering of islands and shallow reefs sitting right on the doorstep of the United States.
It is the ultimate historical case study in geography dictating destiny. Throughout the century and a half we are covering, the Bahamas functioned as a mirror, or perhaps a shadow economy, to the United States.
Right, because whenever its massive neighbor experienced a crisis, a war, or enacted a prohibition, the geographical position of the Bahamas suddenly turned into gold.
But capitalizing on someone else's chaos is fundamentally different from building a self-sustaining internal economy. So true. Okay, let's start the clock. We are using a highly detailed historical text covering the social, political, and economic evolution of the archipelago as our roadmap today. The starting point is August 1st, 1834.
The Emancipation Act.
The Emancipation Act. This is the moment the British Empire officially abolishes slavery. But if you're a person enslaved in the Bahamian Islands on July 31st, your life on August 2nd doesn't actually look much like freedom, does it?
Not at all. The legal framework of emancipation was deeply compromised. The British government instituted what they termed an apprenticeship system.
Right.
The stated goal was to gently transition the enslaved workforce into a free market economy. But in practice, it was just a rebranding of indentured servitude.
Yeah, completely.
The authorities divided the newly freed population into two distinct categories. You had the praedials, who were the agricultural field hands, and the non-praedials, which encompassed domestic servants, mechanics, and craftsmen. And the rules governing this so-called apprenticeship were just staggering in their rigidity. Praedials were legally bound to work for their former masters for an additional 6 years.
6 years?
Non-praedials were bound for 4 years. Now, history tells us that the system was ultimately truncated, and everyone was released after 4 years in 1838.
Right.
But imagine living through those 4 years. The colonial legislature passed incredibly draconian vagrancy laws to maintain absolute social control.
Yeah, the threshold for criminalization was absurdly low. Under these new laws, a newly freed apprentice could be heavily fined, whipped, or thrown into a workhouse for offenses that were entirely subjective.
Like what?
Oh, like loud singing in the street, flying a kite too close to a public highway, loitering. The legal architecture was specifically designed to ensure that the physical labor continued uninterrupted and that the social hierarchy remained frozen in place, despite the abolition of the institution of slavery itself.
Which brings us to the financial mechanics of emancipation. And this is where the history becomes genuinely enraging.
It really is.
To appease the powerful plantation lobbies, the British Parliament voted to distribute £20 million to compensate slave owners across the entire empire.
And the distribution of that massive sum was not arbitrary. It was calculated using a complex formula that factored in the total agricultural export value of each colony divided by its enslaved population.
And that's where the Bahamian geography and soil quality really worked against them. The Bahamian agricultural economy had already been in terminal decline for decades.
Yeah, the thin topsoil of the islands was just exhausted.
They were barely exporting anything. So when the math was done, the colonial master class in the Bahamas received just over £128,000 as compensation for roughly 10,000 human beings.
That averages out to about £12, 14 shillings per head. To put that in perspective, that was the absolute lowest average valuation in all 19 British slave colonies.
Wow.
Yeah, in British Guiana, where the sugar plantations were still highly profitable, owners received closer to £50 a head.
Let me put this in modern terms for the listener. Imagine a massive, corrupt corporation that has spent generations exploiting its frontline workers.
Okay.
The company finally goes bankrupt. The government steps in to liquidate the assets. They give massive, multi-million-dollar golden parachutes to the executives who ran the company into the ground, and the workers who actually break their backs building the wealth are pushed out the back door into a desolate wasteland with absolutely zero severance. Nothing.
That's an incredibly accurate analogy. The financial reality was bleak. Furthermore, most of that £128,000 never even circulated in the Bahamian economy.
Right. Where does it go?
It went straight into the ledgers of merchant creditors and mortgage holders in Nassau, or straight back to London. It wasn't used to modernize the out-island plantations or invest in new industries. Consequently, the plantation system, which was already on life support, just flatlined completely.
The entire formal economy of the archipelago collapsed.
Yeah.
Because what were these 10,000 newly freed people supposed to do? They have no capital, no tools, and no land.
Exactly. The logical pivot for a freed agricultural population would be to transition into independent subsistence farming. But the land tenure system enacted by the Crown made that mathematically impossible.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, the Crown held vast tracts of undeveloped land across the islands. However, a prevailing economic theory in London dictated that Crown land should never be given away for free, lest it devalue the labor market. So they set the price at £1 per acre and mandated that land could only be purchased in minimum blocks of 40 acres.
40 pounds. For someone who had literally been considered property just a few years prior, you might as well have asked them for 40 million pounds.
Absolutely.
It was a completely insurmountable barrier to entry.
Forced by this policy, the vast majority of freed Bahamians had no choice but to become squatters. They retreated deep into the bush, scratching out a meager existence on exhausted, rocky soil.
Yeah.
They lived under the constant looming threat of eviction, knowing that technically they had no legal right to the ground they were farming. It created a generational cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement.
But there is one massive glaring exception to this grim reality, and it centers on a man named Lord John Roll in the Exuma Islands.
Ah, yes. Lord Roll was a wealthy Devonshire aristocrat and an absentee landlord. He never actually set foot in the Bahamas, but he was the largest single slave owner in the colony, holding nearly 400 enslaved people across multiple large tracts in Exuma.
Right.
When emancipation became the law of the land, he executed a legal maneuver that was entirely unprecedented in the region. He deeded all of his extensive land holdings directly to his former slaves and their descendants to be held in common in perpetuity.
That's huge. And the impact of that single act reverberates all the way into the present day. If you travel to Exuma right now and visit settlements like Rollville or Rolltown, you will find that nearly half the population carries the surname Roll.
It's a profound genealogical and geographic legacy. It really illustrates what happens when the barrier to land ownership is removed.
But Exuma was the anomaly, right?
Totally. For the vast majority of the archipelago, the 1840s and 1850s were defined by a deep, crushing stagnation. The colonial government was continually on the brink of bankruptcy. The population was dispersed, isolated, and living on the edge of starvation. The exhausted soil offered absolutely no economic salvation.
And this is where we return to our core theme, the map. Just as the Bahamian economy seems hopelessly trapped in a permanent depression, a massive geopolitical crisis erupts right next door.
In April 1861, the American Civil War begins.
Instantly, Nassau's geographical proximity to the American South goes from being an irrelevant footnote to becoming its most vital and lucrative asset.
The blockade runners.
Yeah, but wait, I'm struggling to see these blockade runners as swashbuckling heroes.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about slipping supplies into the Confederacy and bringing cotton out, weren't these guys fundamentally war profiteers?
Oh, absolutely.
They were artificially extending a brutal, bloody conflict that was fought over the preservation of slavery just so they could make a quick buck on cotton margins.
From a moral and historical standpoint, your assessment is completely accurate. They undeniably prolonged the American Civil War by supplying the Confederate armies with the material they needed to keep fighting.
Right.
However, if we examine the primary sources detailing the culture in Nassau at the time, the overwhelming sentiment was completely devoid of ideology. The local Bahamians and the flood of foreign adventurers who arrived in their ports were largely indifferent to the politics of the North or the South.
They didn't care who won.
Exactly. They weren't debating states' rights or abolition. They were focused entirely on the massive arbitrage opportunity. They cared about cotton and they cared about gold. This establishes a recurring theme of the Bahamas acting as an impartial, profit-driven intermediary.
It's geography completely overriding morality. Let's break down the mechanics of this boom because it's fascinating. Early in the war, President Lincoln declares a total naval blockade of the southern ports. The Confederacy has a massive problem. They have almost no industrial manufacturing base. They desperately need rifles, boots, lead, and medicine to supply their troops. And the only way to buy those things is to export their only massive cash crop, cotton.
And to choke this off, the Union Navy constructs a massive blockade fleet. It eventually swells to around 700 vessels. They deploy shallow draft propeller gunboats and uniquely designed canoe-shaped paddle boats known as double enders.
Double enders.
Yeah, these ships had rudders at both ends, meaning they didn't even have to turn around in narrow coastal channels to change direction. They were stationed aggressively outside major southern ports like Charleston, South Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina.
And if you look at a nautical chart, Wilmington is only about 640 miles from the safety of the Bahamian Cays. If you have a fast ship, that is just a couple of days' steam.
Nassau naturally evolved into the perfect neutral entrepot, a massive transshipment hub. The British government in London had issued strict instructions to the Bahamian governor to maintain absolute neutrality. This meant that actual warships from either the Union or the Confederacy could not use Nassau as a base of operations, but private, commercial, merchant vessels, blockade runners. They were classified as civilian traders and were welcomed with open arms.
You have to picture the technology involved here because it was cutting edge for the 1860s. Our historical text details the exploits of a young man named Thomas Taylor.
Right, the supercargo.
Yeah, he's only 20 years old, acting as a supercargo for a wealthy Liverpool cotton firm. His employers financed the construction of a custom-built ship specifically designed to beat the federal blockade. It's called the Banshee.
The Banshee represented a massive leap in naval architecture. It was the first ocean-going vessel ever constructed entirely of steel plates.
But the trade-off for speed was terrifying. Those steel plates were incredibly thin. Taylor described them as being only 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch thick.
Wow, that's nothing.
They would literally buckle and leak in heavy seas. But the ship was incredibly fast and drew only 8 feet of water, meaning it could slip over the coastal sandbars that the deeper draft federal cruisers couldn't cross.
And the operational tactics of these runs read like modern stealth warfare. They stripped the Banshee of all unnecessary masts and rigging to reduce its silhouette.
Smart.
They painted the entire vessel a highly specific shade of slate gray that rendered it virtually invisible against the night sea. And crucially, they burned smokeless anthracite coal, ensuring they wouldn't leave a telltale black plume in the sky for Union lookouts to spot.
The human element is just as wild. Taylor sails with a captain named Steele, who reportedly had absolutely no sense of fear, and a pilot from Wilmington named Tom Burroughs.
Ah, Tom Burroughs.
Burroughs is one of those figures from history who seems almost mythical. According to Taylor's memoirs, Burroughs had an instinct for navigation that bordered on genius. He knew the shifting sandbars and currents of the Carolina coast so intimately that Taylor claimed he could, quote, smell a cruiser in the pitch black before anyone else on deck even sensed the change in the wind.
The tension of these voyages must have been suffocating. Imagine the sensory deprivation.
Oh, there is this one specific anecdote in the sources that puts you right on the deck of the Banshee. It's the dead of night. They're attempting to creep into Wilmington, trying to slip through the cordon of federal blockade ships. Every single light on the Banshee is extinguished.
Complete blackout.
The engineers have actually tied down the safety valves on the steam engine so they won't vent and make a sound. The crew is communicating only in whispers. Burroughs, standing on the bow in the dark, asks for a sounding. A sailor drops a lead weight coated with tallow into the water to check the depth and pick up a sample of the seafloor.
The sailor hauls the lead back up, feels it in the dark, and whispers the report back. 16 fathoms. Sandy bottom with black specks.
And just from that microscopic detail sand with black specks at 16 fathoms, Burroughs knows their exact coordinates. He realizes, with absolute horror, that they have navigated right into the center of the federal fleet.
Oh, no.
They're surrounded. They literally ghost past 3 different heavily armed federal cruisers in the dark. They're close enough to hear the Union sailors talking on the decks, but the slate gray paint works. They aren't spotted.
Amazing.
But as dawn begins to break, the cover of darkness vanishes, and they are suddenly staring down the barrels of 6 federal gunboats.
And this is where the geography of the coastline saves them. Because just as the Union gunboats prepare to open fire on the Banshee, which, by the way, is packed with tons of highly explosive gunpowder in its hold, the Confederate artillerymen at Fort Fisher guarding the inlet spot the chase.
Right.
They fire a massive artillery shell that arcs right over the Banshee's mast and lands among the Federal ships, warning them to back off.
The adrenaline dump on that ship must have been insane. Taylor wrote that as soon as they dropped anchor in the safety of the harbor, it was time for champagne cocktails all around because you didn't survive a blockade run every day.
And the financial rewards for taking those risks were astronomical. The economics of the blockade completely warped the scale of wealth. A successful captain could clear 1,000 pounds for a single round trip.
1,000 pounds?
The pilot, whose specialized local knowledge was invaluable, also made 1,000 pounds. Even a low-ranking ordinary seaman was paid 20 pounds a month, plus a 10-pound bounty for every successful trip.
We need to put those numbers into perspective for the listener. Before the Civil War started, in 1860, the total value of all imports into the entire colony of the Bahamas was about 234,000 pounds.
Okay.
By 1864, at the peak of the blockade running, the value of imports had skyrocketed to over 5.3 million pounds. It was a tsunami of cash.
The physical transformation of Nassau was profound. The colonial government suddenly had massive surplus revenues. Bay Street, the main commercial thoroughfare, was widened and paved. Curbstones were laid down. Streetlights were installed for the first time in the island's history. The crippling public debt that had plagued the colony since emancipation was erased overnight.
The sources describe a town that had gone completely mad with excitement. The wharves were groaning under the weight of goods. Bales of southern cotton were stacked to the ceilings in every available warehouse, and when those filled up, they stacked them on the lawns.
Just lying out in the open.
Yeah. The Royal Victoria Hotel is a great symbol of this. It had just been constructed with the hope of attracting wealthy, genteel winter tourists. Instead, its verandas were packed with Confederate spies, Union informants, naval officers on half pay, and famous war correspondents like Frank Vizetelly. Common laborers who used to scrape by on fish and yams were drinking imported champagne. It was a gold rush on a tropical island.
But the fundamental flaw of this economy was its dependency. It was a boom built entirely on a proxy crisis. The Bahamians didn't control the supply of the cotton, and they didn't control the demand for the weapons.
So what happens when the war ends?
Well, in January 1865, the geopolitical reality shifted violently. Fort Fisher, the guardian of Wilmington, finally fell to a massive Union amphibious assault. General Sherman was carving his destructive path through the Carolinas.
The ports are choked off, the pipeline is severed.
In April 1865, Lee surrenders at Appomattox. The American Civil War ends. And abruptly, the engine of the Bahamian economy is simply switched off. The foreign speculators, the captains, the spies, they all pack up their bags and sail away, leaving the Bahamians behind.
They leave behind an incredibly deflated local economy, massively inflated prices, and to make matters worse, a raging typhoid epidemic brought in by the transient population.
The fragility of the geographical boom is exposed, and nature delivers the final, crushing blow. In October 1866, barely a year after the war ends, the worst hurricane in living memory slams directly into New Providence. The tidal surge and the winds literally and figuratively wash away whatever residual wealth was left on the docks. The streetlights on Bay Street go dark. The massive new warehouses sit completely empty, echoing with the wind. The Bahamas plunges headfirst into a brutal depression that will last for half a century.
This 50-year slump, stretching from the late 1860s right up to World War I, is a fascinating and often overlooked period. Because with the easy money of the blockade gone, the Bahamian people are forced to look inward.
Right, they have to figure out how to survive using their own internal resources. They have to try to make the dirt work.
The traditional backup plan for the coastal population had always been wrecking, right?
Yes, wrecking. This was the highly organized industry of salvaging cargo from merchant ships that had the misfortune of crashing onto the treacherous, poorly charted Bahamian reefs.
But even that gets taken away from them.
Indeed. The British Imperial Lighthouse Service recognized the massive loss of shipping and began a systematic, heavily funded campaign to illuminate the archipelago. They built powerful, modern lighthouses at critical navigational choke points: Great Isaac's Rock in 1859, Cay Lobos, El Boque.
So the ships just stopped crashing.
Right. As these brilliant lights began sweeping across the previously dark reefs, and as the global shipping fleet transitioned from wind-dependent sail to more maneuverable steam power, the wrecks simply stopped happening. The salvage industry evaporated.
So the average Bahamian is forced back to the land and to the shallow seas. The historical text outlines a series of agricultural false starts during this period, where the colony legitimately tried to build sustainable, export-driven industries. Let's look at the pineapple boom.
It is a little-known historical fact that the Bahamas was actually the first commercial producer of pineapples on a large scale in the world.
Wait, really? Way before Hawaii, before the massive plantations in Florida.
Long before. The specific geological makeup of certain islands, particularly the red loams found in Eleuthera and Cat Island, provided the perfect acidic environment for cultivation. They produced a highly sought-after variety known as the sugarloaf pine.
And it was profitable.
The profit margins were initially incredible. Historical records note that a farmer could sell these pineapples for mere pennies on the docks in Nassau, but by the time that same fruit was transported to Covent Garden in London, it would fetch a sovereign, a solid gold coin apiece.
The crop became so integral to their identity that they proudly featured a pineapple on the very first Bahamian postage stamp.
Yet within a few decades, the entire industry collapsed. The failure was a devastating combination of internal mismanagement and insurmountable external competition. Internally, the Bahamian farmers practiced a deeply flawed agricultural method.
They weren't rotating their crops, right?
Yeah. Exactly. They didn't understand or implement crop rotation. They would clear-cut attractive land, plant the pines, and exhaust the fragile nutrients. The soil lost 50% of its productivity in just 5 years. Furthermore, they suffered catastrophic pest invasions. Swarms of rats and voracious land crabs would descend on the fields and devour an entire harvest overnight.
Ugh, land crabs. And then the geopolitical map works against them again.
Precisely. In 1898, the United States Congress passed the McKinley Tariff, which placed a cripplingly high import tax on foreign fruit. Simultaneously, heavily capitalized American investors began developing massive, cheap labor sugar and pineapple plantations in Cuba.
And Hawaii, too.
Yes. At the same time, the U.S. government began heavily subsidizing the nascent industry in Hawaii. The Bahamian farmers dealing with exhausted soil and zero government support were completely squeezed out of the global market.
Desperate for an alternative, they pivot to a completely different plant.
Sisal. Sisal is a hardy agave plant used to manufacture strong rope and twine. It requires very little water and can grow in incredibly poor soil, making it seemingly perfect for the Bahamian landscape.
Right.
This venture was heavily spurred by British capital. Joseph Chamberlain, who was a deeply influential politician serving as the Secretary of State for the colonies, invested a massive amount of his own family's fortune into establishing colossal sisal plantations on the island of Andros.
And his son, Neville Chamberlain, who most people know as the British Prime Minister who signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler, actually spent a significant portion of his youth living on Andros, managing these vast, sweltering plantations for his father.
The Chamberlain investment sparked a brief boom, particularly when global demand for rope spiked during the Spanish-American War. But once again, external forces crushed the local effort.
What happened this time?
The United States took control of the Philippines and injected massive amounts of modern capital and machinery into their native hemp industry. The Bahamian sisal, which was largely processed by hand, often crudely beaten by laborers standing in stagnant saltwater pits, simply couldn't compete on either price or quality. The Chamberlain estate was eventually abandoned at a massive loss.
Which leaves the sea. If the dirt won't grow anything, you have to look in the water. This brings us to the sponge industry. And this is where the economic and social structures of the Bahamas during this slump get really dark.
The geography of the islands provides one of the greatest natural sponge beds in the world, an expansive, incredibly shallow area west of Andros, known colloquially as the Mud. Because the water depth was often less than 20 feet, the Bahamians didn't require expensive, dangerous hard hat diving gear. Laborers could harvest the sponges from small dinghies using long wooden poles equipped with iron hooks, looking down through a simple glass-bottomed bucket to spot their prey.
It sounds like a relatively straightforward, accessible industry. But the reality of how the labor was managed was grueling and deeply exploitative. I want you to imagine the history of coal mining in the Appalachian Mountains.
Ah, the company store.
Exactly. You might be familiar with the concept of the company store. The coal company pays its miners not in U.S. dollars, but in proprietary scrip. The miner can only spend that scrip at the store owned by the company, where the prices for basic necessities are hugely inflated. The miner quickly falls into debt to the company and is forced to keep working just to pay off the interest. It is a perpetual cycle of financial servitude.
That is the exact economic mechanism utilized by the Nassau merchant class to control the Bahamian sponge industry. Locally, it was known as the truck system.
Right, so the sailors who went out to the mud were not paid a standard weekly wage. Theoretically, on paper, they were considered partners in the voyage, entitled to a share of the final profits after the catch was sold. But before embarking on a brutal 5 to 8 week voyage, the desperately poor sailor needed supplies for his family left behind on shore.
Naturally.
The ship owner, the Nassau merchant, would graciously offer an advance on the sailor's future profits. But this advance was not given in cash. It was paid out in goods from the merchant's own warehouse.
The abuses of this system were catastrophic for the working class. A local magistrate, Justice L.D. Pauls, wrote a deeply scathing, detailed indictment of the truck system in 1888. He documented merchants providing advances in the form of spoiled flour that wasn't fit for livestock and heavily adulterated sugar, all invoiced at exorbitant, massively inflated prices.
And the sailors had no choice.
None. The sailor, needing actual currency to leave with his wife, would immediately have to take those spoiled goods out to the street and sell them to a third party at half their stated value just to get a few shillings.
So before the ship even leaves the dock, the laborer is in debt. And the work itself was a physical nightmare. Imagine spending 2 months baking under a pitiless tropical sun in a small, cramped schooner. When you pull a sponge from the sea, it's not the clean, soft thing you have in your bathroom.
No, it's alive.
Right. It's a living animal covered in a black, gelatinous membrane. The sailors had to construct wooden enclosures in the shallows called krolls, where they would dump the sponges and leave them to rot in the salt water until the animal matter decayed. The stench of a sponge boat returning to harbor was reportedly so foul it would make people on shore physically ill.
And after all that suffering, the financial return for the men who did the actual hooking was pitiful. Powell cites one specific heartbreaking ledger in his report. A crew spent weeks on the mud and successfully harvested 8,100 sponges.
8,100 sponges.
They brought them back to the Nassau Sponge Exchange, which, interestingly, was dominated by a tight-knit community of Greek immigrant merchants who strictly controlled the export pricing. When those 8,100 sponges were auctioned, the entire catch yielded a total of just 11 pounds.
11 pounds. For weeks of labor and over 8,000 sponges.
It breaks down to barely a half penny per sponge. Meanwhile, Pauls noted that those exact same sponges, once cleaned, trimmed, and shipped to the markets in London or Paris, would retail for up to 5 shillings apiece, a markup of thousands of %.
Incredible.
The systemic inequality of the truck system heavily favored a small, insular class of Nassau outfitters and merchants, enriching them while grinding the black laborers into a generational, inescapable poverty.
And it's crucial to understand that crippling poverty wasn't solely afflicting the black Bahamian population. The historical sources reveal a really grim demographic reality affecting the isolated, pure white settlements in the out islands during this long slump.
This brings up a fascinating point about the compounding effects of geographical isolation and intense social segregation. In 1903, the Baltimore Geographical Society organized a comprehensive scientific and medical expedition to the Bahamas.
What did they find?
As part of their research, they visited highly isolated settlements like Hopetown on the island of Abaco and Spanish Wells off the coast of Eleuthera. These communities were populated by the direct descendants of American loyalists, white colonists who had fled the United States during the American Revolution. For over a century, these enclaves had maintained strict racial segregation with an absolute religious tenacity.
They completely refused to intermarry with the black majority. In some cases, they wouldn't even allow black Bahamians to remain on their islands after the sun went down.
But by enforcing that segregation on tiny, remote islands, they severely restricted their own population pool. In Hopetown, for example, the scientists discovered that almost all of the roughly 1,000 inhabitants were directly descended from a single matriarch, a woman named Wyannie Malone, who had arrived from South Carolina in 1785.
That's wow.
The genetic consequences of over a century of extreme, unavoidable inbreeding were tragically apparent. The Baltimore expedition documented alarmingly high rates of genetic anomalies, dwarfism, congenital blindness, deafness, and debilitating neurological conditions like locomotor ataxia.
The scientists from Baltimore actually wrote in their final report that these specific communities were in imminent danger of complete extinction due to genetic degeneracy. It paints an incredibly stark, depressing picture of the colony. By the time World War I erupts in Europe, the Bahamas is a forgotten backwater. The war effort drains their already limited manpower. There are acute food shortages. A major local bank collapses, wiping out savings. Nassau in 1918 is sleepy, broke, structurally decaying, and entirely abandoned by global commerce.
But then the United States government decides to embark on a massive, highly moralistic social experiment.
In 1919, the United States ratifies the 18th Amendment. Prohibition. The sale, production, and transportation of alcoholic beverages becomes instantly illegal across the entire country.
And once again, a legal prohibition in the United States instantly turns the Bahamian coordinates on the map into pure, unadulterated gold.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is the Civil War blockade running era all over again, but this time, instead of raw cotton and gunpowder, it's rye whiskey, rum, and gin. Nassau transforms overnight into the Wild West. You have American bootleggers, mafia enforcers, and opportunistic gangsters flooding the tiny town.
Yeah, the historical accounts describe men sitting on the wooden wharves, using towering stacks of empty liquor crates as tables, casually playing poker for pots of $100 bills. A relatively modest boarding house on Frederick Street called the Lucerne Hotel becomes the undisputed headquarters of the underworld. They threw an infamous raucous party that went down in local lore as the Bootleggers' Ball.
The scale of the logistical operation was staggering, utilizing the specific geography of the islands to outmaneuver the U.S. Coast Guard. Fast, heavily modified motorboats, often equipped with powerful surplus aircraft engines, were making the treacherous high-speed dash across the Gulf Stream directly to the inlets of Florida.
Right, the rum runners.
Simultaneously, much larger ocean-going schooners were being loaded to the gunwales in Nassau and sailing north to anchor in international waters off the coasts of New York and Boston, forming the famous floating liquor markets known as Rum Row.
Now, here is where the mechanics of this era get really interesting. How did the Bahamians make this massive smuggling operation look legal on paper? Because the Bahamas is still a British crown colony. They have customs officers, they have import duties, they have an entire legal framework.
Right, you couldn't just tell the harbor master you're shipping 1,000 cases of scotch to Al Capone in Chicago.
Exactly. This is where we see a crucial evolution in the political power dynamics of the colony. During the Civil War boom, the vast majority of the profits were extracted by foreign speculators and British shipping firms. The Bahamians just provided the port. During Prohibition, however, a shrewd, deeply connected group of local Bahamian merchants, who would collectively come to be known as the Bay Street Boys, realized they could capture the wealth for themselves. Because they controlled the local House of Assembly, they quite literally wrote the customs laws.
So they engineered a legal fiction.
Exactly. They utilized a brilliantly simple piece of paperwork fraud that we can call the Miquelon loophole. The Bahamian government deliberately maintained a hefty import duty on all foreign liquor entering the port of Nassau. This generated massive revenue for the treasury. However, the law stated that if a merchant re-exported that same liquor to a legal foreign destination, they could claim an 80% tariff drawback, a massive refund from the government.
But again, to get the refund, you had to produce a manifest proving the booze was going to a place where alcohol was legal.
Right, so by a completely coordinated, institutionalized myth, the Bahamian merchants began falsely manifesting their massive outward liquor shipments as being destined for Saint-Pierre and Miquelon.
Which is a tiny, freezing, barren French island territory located just off the coast of Newfoundland in the North Atlantic.
The statistical absurdity of this paperwork is hilarious. In 1920, before the loophole was fully exploited, official Bahamian exports to Miquelon were precisely zero. In 1922, the official customs ledgers recorded 1.2 million pounds worth of exports to Miquelon.
It's so blatant.
On paper, 66% of all Bahamian global exports were supposedly being shipped to this tiny frozen rock near Canada. In reality, the ships would leave Nassau, dump their cargo on the Florida coast or Rum Row, and return a few days later with empty holds and bags of cash, and the customs officers would happily stamp the Miquelon paperwork and issue the refund.
The sheer volume of cash flowing through the island was almost impossible to manage. Total re-exports of liquor hit 1.6 million pounds in 1922 alone. The local branch of the Royal Bank of Canada in Nassau was completely overwhelmed. They allegedly had 11 million US dollars sitting in physical currency in their vaults.
Wow.
The bank managers were so terrified of rumors that armed Cuban hijackers were sailing over to rob them that they had the building surrounded by local police officers armed with rifles and fixed bayonets.
And this tsunami of revenue completely modernized the physical infrastructure of Nassau. The government, now flush with cash from the 20% of the import duty they kept, undertook massive public works projects. They dredged and deepened the harbor to accommodate larger cruise ships. They built modern concrete docks. They installed a municipal water supply and sewerage system.
They laid miles of paved roads.
Yeah, they even subsidized the construction of massive, luxurious new resorts like the New Colonial Hotel to cater to the influx of wealthy Americans who wanted to drink in the sun.
But while the physical city was modernized, the social and economic divide was severely deepened. The Bay Street merchants used this era to permanently entrench their wealth and political dominance.
Yes. They built the foundation of a modern city, but the economic architecture was explicitly designed to funnel the profits into the pockets of the white merchant oligarchy, while the black majority provided the cheap physical labor on the docks and in the warehouses. And, true to the historical pattern, a boom built on American legislation inevitably crashes when that legislation changes.
In 1933, the party comes to a screeching halt. Franklin D. Roosevelt takes office, the U.S. Congress passes the 21st Amendment repealing Prohibition, and the endless river of bootleg money dries up in an instant. The Bahamas plunges straight back into the harsh reality of the global Great Depression.
Which forces the Bahamian leadership into a corner. They have spent the last decade building incredible infrastructure, the modern deepwater docks, the luxury hotels, the paved roads, but now they desperately need a legitimate reason for people to come and spend money there.
They aggressively pivot to promoting tourism and attracting foreign investment. And in their desperation to bring in capital, they end up attracting a surreal, almost cinematic cast of characters that put Nassau squarely on the global map during the 1930s and the turbulent years of World War II.
By examining this era, we can see how the desperation for foreign capital inadvertently ignited deep-seated racial and class conflicts that had been simmering since emancipation.
I want you to imagine the atmosphere on this tiny, 21-mile-long island during the height of World War II. It's a powder keg. You have a deeply impoverished, frustrated local workforce. You have an eccentric, foul-mouthed, gold-mining multimillionaire. And you have the exiled former King of England, all colliding in the same small town.
Let's start by examining the multimillionaire, Sir Harry Oakes. His impact on the physical landscape of New Providence was unparalleled.
Oakes's backstory is incredible. He was a rough-around-the-edges prospector who spent years living in the dirt before he finally struck the mother lode in northern Ontario, Canada. He discovered the Lake Shore mine, which turned out to be one of the richest, most productive gold mines in the entire hemisphere.
So he's overnight wealthy.
He becomes absurdly, unfathomably wealthy. But he develops a vitriolic hatred for the Canadian government's tax policies. He calculates that between income taxes and corporate taxes, the government is confiscating something like 85% of his earnings.
Seeking a haven for his fortune, he becomes one of the world's most prominent tax refugees. A highly persuasive local Bahamian real estate developer named Harold Christie recognizes the opportunity and heavily lobbies Oakes to move his residency and his capital to the Bahamas in 1934, touting the colony's absence of income tax.
Oakes arrives and basically buys the island. He purchases 7,000 acres of prime real estate in New Providence, roughly one-third of the entire island. He buys the massive British colonial hotel outright. When he realizes the island lacks modern transportation links, he personally finances and builds the first airport, Oaks Field.
During the depths of the Depression.
Yes, when the local government was paralyzed, Oaks is employing a massive army of local Bahamian laborers who were on the absolute edge of starvation.
Through sheer financial force, he inserts himself into the highest echelons of Bahamian society. He leverages his economic weight to win a seat in the House of Assembly. He becomes an overbearing, dominant force, frequently clashing with the established Bay Street merchants who resent his crude manners but desperately need his money.
And into this volatile mix, in 1940, the British government drops a diplomatic bomb. They appoint the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, the man who famously abdicated the throne to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, as the new governor of the Bahamas.
The appointment was a thinly veiled exile. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was deeply concerned by the Duke's well-documented Nazi sympathies and his pre-war visits to Germany. Churchill feared that if the Duke remained in Europe, he could be kidnapped or manipulated by the Axis powers to serve as a puppet monarch.
So they ship him off.
Sending him across the Atlantic to a minor, sleepy Caribbean colony was a strategic maneuver to keep him out of the way.
The Duke and the Duchess were, predictably, insulted by the assignment. Wallis Simpson reportedly complained bitterly to her friends, comparing the post to Napoleon's humiliating exile on Elba or St. Helena. Upon arriving in Nassau, they inspect Government House, declare it entirely unlivable and infested with termites, and immediately demand a £5,000 renovation budget.
In 1940, £5,000 was a staggering fortune.
Yeah, and the local Bahamian population, many of whom were living in shacks without running water, had to foot the bill through colonial taxes, which generated immense, quiet resentment.
To be fair to the historical record, the Duke did apply himself to the administrative duties of the governorship far more diligently than London expected. However, his worldview was inherently aristocratic and deeply paternalistic. And his tenure in Government House happened to coincide with the specific economic shock that truly awakened the modern Bahamian political consciousness, the 1942 riots.
This is a massive turning point. The United States officially enters World War II. Because the Bahamas is strategically located guarding the shipping lanes to the Caribbean and South America, the U.S. and Britain signed an agreement to construct massive, state-of-the-art air bases in New Providence to hunt German U-boats.
The American engineering firm awarded the contract, Pleasantville Company, arrives in Nassau. They are operating on a massive military budget and a tight timeline. They need thousands of laborers immediately. And operating under standard American wartime contracting practices, they were fully prepared to pay the local Bahamian workforce standard American wages. The going rate was at least $1.50 an hour.
I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a Bahamian laborer in 1942. For your entire life, the local merchant class has suppressed your wages. You are used to making a couple of shillings for an entire day of backbreaking work. Suddenly, this American company arrives and offers to pay you $1.50 an hour. It is life-changing, generational wealth. It's the opportunity to pull your family out of poverty.
But the Bahamian government, which, remember, is completely controlled by the Bay Street merchant oligarchy, panics. They look ahead and realize that if the black Bahamian workforce gets accustomed to American wages, the local economy will be upended.
Because they can't control them anymore.
Right. When the war ends and the Americans leave, the merchants will never be able to force the laborers back to working for pennies on the docks or in the retail shops. So the Bahamian government formally intervenes. They utilize colonial labor laws to artificially peg the wages for local laborers on the base construction project at a maximum of 4 shillings a day.
The cruelty of that decision is staggering. So you have a situation where black Bahamians are driving dump trucks and pouring concrete in the blazing sun for 4 shillings a day. And they are working shoulder to shoulder with white American contractors doing the exact same manual labor. But the Americans are taking home 10 times the pay.
The blatant hypocrisy and economic violence of that disparity shattered the long-standing illusion of paternalism. The Bahamian workforce realized clearly that their own government was actively legislating to keep them impoverished. On the morning of June 1st, 1942, the simmering frustration boiled over. A massive crowd of laborers refused to work, gathered their tools, and marched over the hill from the poor neighborhoods directly into the affluent, white-dominated downtown commercial district of Bay Street.
It wasn't a peaceful protest. It was an explosion of rage. The mob smashed the plate glass windows of the merchant shops, overturned cars, and looted the stores. A fire broke out in the police station. The colonial authorities completely lost control of the city.
The response was brutal. The military was called out, the riot act was formally read in the streets, and a strict martial law was declared. In the ensuing clashes, the military fired into the crowds. 2 Bahamians were killed and dozens were seriously injured.
The 1942 riot was a brutal, bloody awakening. It stripped away the polite veneer of the colony and exposed the stark racial and economic inequalities that had been intentionally baked into the system for a century. But incredibly, right in the middle of this intense wartime tension, with the island still reeling from the riots, Nassau is rocked by a sensational crime that pushes the war off the front pages.
Ah, yes. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes, July 1943.
It remains one of the most infamous, analyzed, and bizarre unsolved murders of the 20th century. Sir Harry Oakes, the richest man in the colony and one of the most powerful men in the British Empire, was found dead in the master bedroom of his sprawling estate, Westbourne.
The details of the crime scene are incredibly macabre. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. Oakes was discovered lying in his bed. He had been brutally bludgeoned about the head with a weapon featuring 4 distinct prongs.
Which investigators later speculated was a winch handle from a boat.
Right. But the killer didn't stop there. They had sprayed Oakes's body and the bed with a highly flammable liquid, likely an insecticide, and set him on fire.
The flames were so intense they blistered the paint on the walls. But curiously, an electric fan had been left oscillating near the bed, which blew the flames away from the curtains, preventing the entire mansion from burning down.
And bizarrely, a trail of feathers from a torn pillow was scattered across the scorching body.
It was a horrific scene that required the immediate deployment of the most sophisticated forensic experts available. Standard protocol dictated that Scotland Yard in London be summoned, or at the very least, the FBI in Washington or Miami.
But the Duke of Windsor, acting with supreme arrogance and poor judgment, completely bypassed the professional channels. He ordered the local Bahamian police to stand down and privately placed a phone call to 2 municipal detectives he knew in Miami, Captain Edward Melchin and Captain James Barker.
Barker's involvement turned the investigation into a complete farce. Barker styled himself as a cutting-edge fingerprint expert, but historical hindsight paints him as deeply corrupt. In fact, he later became severely addicted to drugs and was killed in a violent shootout. But in 1943, he arrives in Nassau and immediately zeroes in on a pre-selected suspect. Oakes' own son-in-law, a tall, arrogant Mauritian playboy named Alfred de Marigny.
De Marigny was the perfect scapegoat. He was widely despised by the conservative Bay Street establishment for his abrasive personality and his habit of flouting local customs. Furthermore, he had recently eloped with Oakes' beloved teenage daughter Nancy, completely against Sir Harry's furious objections. The 2 men hated each other openly.
Barker claims to find the smoking gun. He announces that he has lifted a pristine, latent fingerprint belonging to Alfred de Marigny from a painted wooden screen that was standing near Oakes' bed. Based almost entirely on this single piece of physical evidence, de Marigny is arrested and charged with capital murder. He is facing the gallows.
But the ensuing trial, which drew journalists from all over the globe, turned into a masterclass in legal defense. De Marigny's defense attorney systematically dismantled Barker's forensic claims. Through grueling cross-examination, he exposed the fact that Barker had no photographic evidence of the fingerprint on the screen before he supposedly lifted it.
The defense attorney laid a brilliant trap. He essentially forced Barker to admit on the stand that the fingerprint evidence was entirely forged. The defense argued convincingly that Barker had secretly lifted de Marigny's print from a glass of water during an earlier interrogation, and then simply claimed he pulled it from the bedroom screen to frame him.
The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of not guilty. De Marigny was acquitted, though he was promptly deported from the colony by the embarrassed government. Because the initial investigation was so thoroughly compromised by Barker's corruption and the Duke's interference, the murder of Sir Harry Oakes remains officially unsolved to this day.
It's an unbelievable saga.
Yeah.
But as the war finally ends, the massive military infrastructure built by the Americans, the deep-water channels, the sprawling air bases, remains in place. And this concrete legacy sets the stage for the next massive era of Bahamian history, the tourism machine.
This post-war era is fascinating because we see 2 massive parallel tracks developing simultaneously. On one track, you have the exponential, highly orchestrated explosion of international tourism. On the other track, you have the organized political rise of the Black Bahamian majority, pushing relentlessly toward full independence.
I need to pause here and look at this from another angle. When you read the history of the 1950s and 60s in the Bahamas, one name dominates everything: Stafford Sands. He was a massive, physically imposing Bay Street lawyer who became the head of the development board.
Very powerful figure.
He is widely credited with architecting the modern Bahamian economy. His aggressive, heavily funded advertising campaigns in North America transformed the island. Tourism went from 32,000 visitors in 1949 to over 750,000 by 1966. Didn't this massive influx of dollars benefit everyone on the island? Wasn't he genuinely building a nation?
That is a deeply debated question in Bahamian history. There is no denying that Stafford Sands possessed a brilliant, ruthless administrative mind. Before Sands, Nassau was essentially a sleepy winter retreat for the incredibly wealthy, open for only 3 months a year. Sands utilized modern marketing to turn it into a year-round mass market destination. He expanded the economic pie to an unprecedented size.
Okay.
But the mechanisms he used to achieve this growth were deeply inequitable. The wealth remained heavily concentrated within his own circle of Bay Street merchants. More importantly, the legal frameworks he drafted systematically excluded Black Bahamians from participating in this new economy as anything other than low-wage service workers.
The most glaring, undeniable example of this inequity is the creation of Freeport.
Exactly. In 1955, Sands facilitated an agreement with an American financier with a checkered past named Wallace Groves. They drafted a piece of legislation called the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. The Bahamian government essentially handed over 50,000 acres of prime crown land on the island of Grand Bahama to Groves' private company.
50,000 acres.
In exchange for Groves promising to dredge a deepwater port and build an industrial zone, the government guaranteed his company absolute freedom from all taxes and customs duties for 99 years and granted them total administrative control over the territory.
It was a shocking surrender of sovereignty. They basically created an independent corporate nation-state right in the middle of the Bahamas.
Freeport boomed, attracting massive foreign investment, chemical plants, and eventually casinos. But it operated as a strictly segregated enclave. You had these luxurious, manicured subdivisions built for the white foreign executives and investors, existing side by side with the squalid, incredibly overcrowded shanty towns like 8 Mile Rock, where the local Bahamian construction and service workers were forced to live in poverty.
This glaring daily reminder of inequality, juxtaposed with the immense new wealth flowing into the country, acts as an accelerant for the political awakening. The Black middle class, many of whom are now educated professionals, realize they need organized political power to dismantle the Bay Street monopoly. They form the Progressive Liberal Party, the PLP.
And the political tension finally snaps the economic machinery in 1958. It begins seemingly as a minor labor dispute. The newly opened international airport was a massive source of revenue. The local independent Black taxi drivers formed a union to secure the lucrative airport transfer routes, but the white-owned tour companies bypassed them, securing exclusive contracts to bus the tourists directly to the hotels.
So what did the taxi drivers do?
In protest, the taxicab union used their vehicles to physically blockade all the exits to the airport, trapping thousands of wealthy tourists.
The dispute quickly escalated far beyond taxi routes. The PRP and other labor leaders recognized the leverage they had and called for a massive general strike. For nearly 3 weeks, the hotel workers, the dock workers, the sanitation crews, everyone walked off the job. The entire tourism-dependent economy of Nassau ground to an absolute halt. The hotels had to close.
The Bay Street establishment was terrified and appealed to London. The British government actually flew in a company of armed troops from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, stationed in Jamaica, to patrol the streets of Nassau and prevent a repeat of the 1942 riots.
But the strike achieved its goal. It crippled the economy just long enough to prove who actually held the power. The British Colonial Office in London, tired of defending the archaic practices of the Bay Street oligarchy, intervened and forced sweeping electoral reforms.
Yes, they abolished the property qualifications that had prevented poor Bahamians from voting, and they created new electoral districts to better reflect the population.
These reforms set the stage for the monumental climax of this political struggle, the 1967 general election. The PLP, now led by a charismatic, London-educated young lawyer named Lyndon Pendling, mounts an incredibly sophisticated and emotionally resonant campaign.
They really tapped into a deep, spiritual well of desire for self-determination. They famously adopted the soaring orchestral theme song from the movie Exodus as their campaign anthem, explicitly casting their political struggle as a biblical journey out of bondage.
I want you to imagine the tension on election night in January 1967. The entire nation is glued to the radio. The returns are coming in from the remote islands by telegraph and boat. And when the final votes are tallied, the result is an absolute unbelievable dead heat. The PLP wins exactly 18 seats. The ruling white oligarchy, the United Bahamian Party, also wins exactly 18 seats.
A constitutional crisis in the making. The balance of power for the entire nation rested in the hands of precisely two men who had won their seats outside the two main parties. One was Randall Fox, a fiercely independent labor leader. The other was Alvin Brainin, a veteran white politician running as an independent.
The pressure on those two men must have been suffocating.
Ultimately, both Fox and Brainin decided to throw their support behind Lyndon Pindeling and the PLP. With their votes, the UBP was ousted from power. After more than 3 centuries, white minority rule in the Bahamas was officially over.
Historians refer to it as the Quiet Revolution because, remarkably, this massive transfer of power occurred entirely at the ballot box, without a single drop of bloodshed. But the aftermath of the election featured a massive scandal that utterly destroyed the legacy of the man who built the tourism machine.
We return to Sir Stafford Sands. Shortly after the PLP took power, a royal commission of inquiry, known as the Bacon Commission, was convened to investigate the deeply secretive process by which the previous government had granted highly lucrative casino gambling licenses in Freeport.
And the commission unearths a staggering paper trail. They discovered that Stafford Sands, while serving as the Minister of Finance and Tourism, had personally received over $1 million in what he termed consultancy fees from the foreign consortium that was granted the casino monopoly.
It was a breathtaking conflict of interest. But it became globally scandalous when the commission revealed that the consortium paying Sands was deeply, heavily connected to Meyer Lansky and the top echelons of the American mafia, who were using the Bahamian casinos to launder illicit funds.
The commission's final report was damning. They concluded that Sands had not earned the $1 million through legal work, but had essentially sold his influence as a government minister. Disgraced, stripped of his power, and facing immense public anger, Sands packed up his fortune and went into permanent, self-imposed exile in Europe.
With the old guard completely vanquished, Pindeling and the PLP consolidated their power and began the relentless push toward full sovereignty. After a few years of intense negotiation with London, the goal was achieved. On July 10, 1973, the Bahamas officially became an independent nation.
The British Union Jack was lowered for the final time.
And the new Bahamian flag, aquamarine for the water, gold for the sun, and a black triangle representing the strength of the people was raised over Nassau.
But the journey to independence wasn't a unified celebration. We have to mention a slightly farcical but incredibly telling footnote in this history. There was a very real secession movement on the island of Abaco.
Abaco had a high concentration of white descendants of the American loyalists who deeply distrusted the black PLP government in Nassau. A local politician named Arrington Watkins led a movement demanding that Abaco be allowed to remain a colony of Great Britain, completely separate from the rest of the Bahamas.
They actually went so far as to hire an American mercenary, a guy named Mitchell Livingston Werbel, who designed silencers for the CIA to help them plot a localized military revolution. They had visions of setting up an independent libertarian tax haven.
The British government flatly refused to entertain the idea, and the plot completely fizzled out without a shot being fired, but it perfectly illustrates the incredibly fragmenting pressures inherent in an archipelagic nation.
And that fragmentation foreshadows the incredible existential challenges that the newly sovereign Bahamas would face as they moved into the late 1970s and 1980s.
Indeed.
So what does this all mean? We've walked through the chaotic boom of the Civil War blockade runners. We've seen the glitzy illegal wealth of prohibition bootlegging. We've traced the rise of the post-war tourism machine. Now we hit the 1980s, and the core theme of this entire journey geography dictating destiny strikes the islands one more time with devastating force.
Just as the shallow cays and hidden inlets were perfect for hiding Confederate cotton and prohibition rum, the geography of the Bahamas in the 1980s made it the absolute perfect transshipment choke point for a new, vastly more dangerous commodity: South American narcotics. Specifically, Colombian cocaine and Jamaican marijuana destined for the insatiable market in Florida.
But this boom was fundamentally horrifically different. The previous economic booms, for all their corruption and inequality, did leave something behind. The Civil War paid for the streetlights and the curbstones. Prohibition paid for the deep-water harbor and the electrical grid. This new boom brought only violent crime, a devastating wave of addiction, and a level of institutional corruption that threatened to consume the entire government.
Furthermore, it highlighted the sheer vulnerability of a newly independent, geographically massive but militarily tiny nation. Defending sovereignty over thousands of square miles of ocean is incredibly difficult. We see this tragically illustrated in 1980 with the HMVS Flamingo incident.
Right.
The Flamingo was a Bahamian marine vessel actively enforcing the nation's sovereign borders by arresting poachers. In response, 2 Cuban MiG fighter jets violated Bahamian airspace, aggressively strafed the vessel, and sank it in the ocean. 4 Bahamian Marines were killed in the attack. It was a stark, brutal reminder of how difficult it is for a small island nation to assert control over its own map.
But the external military threat from Cuba paled in comparison to the internal rot caused by the drug cartels. The sheer scale and audacity of the logistical operations are mind-boggling. You had entire islands effectively annexed by foreign criminals. The most notorious example is Norman's Cay in the Exumas.
Oh,
It was practically taken over by the Medellin cartel, managed on the ground by the fugitive American financier Robert Vesco and the smuggler Carlos Later. They heavily armed the island, extended the runway, and turned it into a massive, heavily defended staging ground for drug flights, routinely chasing off local Bahamians at gunpoint.
The volume of narcotics moving through the archipelago was staggering. In one instance, authorities discovered a stockpile of marijuana at a place called Black Rock that was so massive the official police report described it not in pounds but by its physical dimensions.
Just a wall of weed.
Exactly. It was a solid wall of bales 2 miles long and 6 feet high. In another raid in Exuma, they seized a single shipment containing 247 pounds of pure cocaine.
The corruption seeped into every level of society, from the barefoot fishermen in Sandy Point we talked about at the beginning, all the way to the halls of power in Nassau. In 1983, the situation reached a boiling point. The American television network, NBC, broadcast an explosive investigative report. They explicitly accused the highest levels of the Pindling government of systematically taking millions in cartel protection money, and they alleged that Bahamian officials were actively tipping off smugglers and blocking undercover FBI sting operations.
Prime Minister Pindling fiercely and vehemently denied the allegations, and he actually launched a defamation lawsuit against NBC. But the domestic and international political pressure became so intense that his government was forced to appoint an independent royal commission of inquiry to investigate the drug trade.
Led by a highly respected jurist, Robert Ellicott QC, this 1983-1984 commission pulled back the curtain on the entire society. They gathered over 24,000 pages of sworn testimony, and the stories that emerged were horrifying.
It confirmed that the immense influx of illicit cash had completely warped local economies. In settlements like Bimini, which sat closest to the Florida coast, the local banks were entirely overwhelmed by deposits. The standard currency for buying a loaf of bread or a soda became the U.S. $100 bill. Fishermen abandoned their boats to become lookouts and refuelers for the go-fast boats.
But the social toll was an absolute catastrophe. The cartels often paid their local Bahamian fixers not in cash but in product. This flooded the local streets with cheap, highly addictive cocaine. An entire generation of Bahamian youth in the poorer neighborhoods of Nassau was decimated by the crack epidemic, what they called freebasing. Violent crime driven by turf wars and addiction skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. The very fabric of the community was tearing apart.
Now, regarding the political fallout, we must be very precise about what the historical record states. The Commission's final report was a devastating indictment of the institutions. It revealed deep, systemic, normalized corruption across the police force, the Customs Department, and local governance. Magistrates were found to be taking bribes to release convicted smugglers.
And what about Pindling?
Strictly reporting on the documented findings, the Commission concluded that they could find no direct, irrefutable evidence that indicted Prime Minister Pindling himself of accepting bribes from the cartels, though they severely criticized his financial disclosures.
While the Prime Minister avoided direct indictment, the psychological and moral damage to the newly independent nation's fabric was undeniable and lasting. It forced a deep, painful reckoning about the cost of relying on the geography of vice.
It is an incredible, sweeping journey. We have traced the trajectory of a people from the brutal, false promises of emancipation in 1834, watching them struggle to survive on exhausted, rocky soil. We have seen them swept up in the manic proxy wealth of the Civil War blockade runners, and then plunged back into 50 years of desperate, exploitative labor in the sponge muds.
Right.
We've witnessed the glamorous, corrupting explosion of prohibition bootlegging, the wartime arrival of eccentric billionaires and bitter royals, the brilliant but inequitable rise of mass tourism, and the dark, violent days of the 1980s drug cartels.
It is a century and a half of history defined almost entirely by location, by the map. I want to thank you for taking this deep dive with us today, because once you understand the weight of this history, it completely changes the way you view the Bahamas. When you look at a postcard of those perfect aquamarine waters and white sand beaches, you realize you aren't just looking at a tourist destination. You are looking at a landscape that has been continually shaped, battered, and enriched by the tidal waves of global conflicts, prohibitions, and appetites.
And as we close this exploration, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder. Throughout the 20th century, even as the tourism and banking sectors grew, successive Bahamian governments tried repeatedly to build self-sustaining internal agricultural industries. They launched massive, heavily capitalized experiments like the expansive Hatchet Bay dairy and poultry farms on Eleuthera or the multi-million-dollar bale sugar project in Abaco. They had the land available, they had massive capital backing, they had modern technology.
Yet, despite all of those resources, these internal industries continually failed. They collapsed under the weight of poor management, lack of economies of scale, or global competition, which leaves the Bahamas today in a precarious position, forced to import roughly 90% of its food supply.
Which brings us right back to where we started, the dirt versus the map. Consider this. Can a small, geographically fragmented archipelagic nation ever truly chart its own independent, self-sustaining economic destiny? Or is it geographically condemned by its position on the map to forever function as an offshore service economy, forever waiting on the periphery, hoping to profit from the desires, the vices, and the conflicts of the mainland?
You look at the map, you see the coordinates, but underneath it all, the historical currents are incredibly deep. It's a lot to think about. Until next time.